Welcome back to Night Whispers, your quiet corner for chilling bedtime stories told in a soft, soothing voice. Tonight's tale takes us away from the coastlines and lighthouses, and into something colder, quieter, and far more unsettling. This is a story of silence, shadows, and the human mind, a tale set inside an abandoned asylum that was never truly left empty. So, settle in, let the rain outside your window keep time with the story, and allow yourself to drift. Because sometimes the darkest places are not the ones outside, but the ones built to keep darkness in. They say the asylum was closed in the late 1970s, its halls emptied after years of neglect, the patients transferred, the doctors gone. But records show not everyone left. Some rooms remained locked, the windows barred, the hallways echoing with whispers that never belonged to the living. And now, decades later, a single ward, untouched, sealed away, is said to breathe on its own. Lights flicker when no power runs through the building. Doors sigh open though rust keeps the hinges shut. And at night, if you stand at the edge of the woods, you can still see a figure pacing the top floor. Tonight, I'll take you inside. Into the Asylum Ward. The asylum sat at the edge of the woods like a wound that never healed. From the road, it looked more like a fortress than a hospital, for stories of crumbling brick, boarded windows, and ivy creeping upward as if the earth itself were trying to swallow it whole. The iron gates that once welcomed patients had long since rusted shut, but someone, perhaps years ago, had cut a path through the fencing. The wire curled back like twisted thorns, just wide enough for a single person to slip through. On nights like this, when the sky hung heavy with rain and the wind dragged its fingers across the trees, the place looked alive. Water trickled down the brickwork like sweat. The shadows in the windows shifted too quickly, as though someone had just stepped away. Thomas Hale, the caretaker sent to catalog what remained of the property, stood at the fence, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. He had been warned not to come alone. The county wanted the asylum surveyed before demolition crews moved in, but most men they sent here never stayed long. Some left after hearing footsteps echoing behind them in empty corridors. Others swore that the building groaned as if resenting their presence, but Thomas wasn't the kind of man to believe in whispers. He told himself that when old buildings settle, they make sounds that resemble voices. That peeling paint and warped would give the illusion of movement. That silence, if stretched long enough, begins to hum in the ears until it feels like breathing. Still, as he pressed his shoulder through the torn wire and stepped onto the overgrown courtyard, he felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. The rain had started to fall harder, tapping against his jacket, muting the crunch of weeds beneath his boots. Ahead, the asylum's doors loomed. They were tall, carved oak, weather-stained but strangely intact, as though the years had left every part of the place to rot except the entrance itself. He paused, pulling the heavy keyring from his pocket. The county clerk had given it to him with a laugh. "Don't expect those to work," she had said. "Most locks are rusted through. But, if you hear anyone asking to be let out, don't." At the time, Thomas had smiled politely. Now, as he slid one of the iron keys into the lock, he found his hands trembling. The door resisted at first. Then, with a deep groan that sounded more like a sigh than metal, it gave way. Inside, the air was colder. It smelled of damp plaster and something faintly metallic, like rust and old blood. His flashlight beam wavered over cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper, catching on a water-stained sign that still clung to the wall. Ward C, restricted access. Thomas stepped inside, and the door drifted shut behind him. The sound it made was final. The beam of Thomas's flashlight cut a narrow path through the dark, but it felt like the shadows pressed harder against him, swallowing everything just beyond its reach. The asylum's main corridor stretched ahead, its ceiling arched, lined with heavy doors on either side. Each one bore a small square window covered in wire mesh. Though most of the glass was cracked or missing entirely, his boots echoed, every step multiplying against the walls until it seemed as if others were walking with him. He paused, listening. The silence afterward was deeper than before, the kind that rings in the ears. On the left, a door bore a faded placard, Ward C, Observation. He lifted the flashlight and peered through the mesh. Inside was a long room, lined with overturned chairs and broken desks. Mold bloomed across the ceiling, dripping in slow, viscous trails down the wall. The glass from shattered bulbs littered the floor like frost. It was what he heard next that made his throat tighten. A faint shuffle, not the creak of settling wood, not the drip of water, but a drag, slow, deliberate, as though a bare foot were moving across tile. He jerked back from the door, his light trembling across the hall. Nothing. Only more closed doors, silent and waiting. His rational mind pushed forward. Rats, he told himself. Or perhaps a loose piece of plaster sliding down. The place was a ruin, it was expected. But his hand tightened on the flashlight anyway, knuckles pale beneath the beam. At the end of the hall, another set of double doors waited. These were heavier, iron-banded, with a broken padlock hanging loosely from one latch. A warning scrawled in chalk still clung faintly to the wood. Do not open. Thomas hesitated. The county records had mentioned Ward C in passing, describing it as an isolation unit. Dangerous patients, experimental treatments, details blurred by bureaucratic language, as though someone had gone to great lengths to keep its history buried. The door groaned as he leaned against it, nudging it open just enough to slip inside. The air was different here, stale, weighted, as though no one had breathed it for decades. His light swept over narrow cells, each one just wide enough for a cot and a rusted drain in the floor. The walls were etched with scratches, some shallow, some gouged so deeply that the brick beneath was exposed. He lingered at the first cell. Words were carved into the plaster, crude but legible. I hear them at night. The second cell bore only a series of tally marks, hundreds of them, etched until the wall was nearly smooth, and in the third, the cot was missing. The drain was filled with something dark, crusted over, as though time itself had tried to conceal it. His stomach tightened. He tried to breathe quietly, but in the silence, his own breath sounded harsh, intrusive. Then, a new sound. From the far end of the ward came a metallic rattle, faint but sharp. Like a chain dragged once across stone, Thomas froze, every muscle locked. His light traced the row of cells, but the sound did not repeat. He whispered to himself. The only comfort he could find: old pipes. That's all. But the words scratched against his throat, unconvincing. At the far end of the corridor, a stairwell descended into deeper dark. A sign above it, rusted and half-fallen, read, Lower Wards. Morgue access. He swallowed hard. For a moment, he considered turning back, sealing the doors, and telling the county that Ward C had collapsed. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe pride, urged him forward. The stairwell yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole, and Thomas stepped down. The stairs creaked beneath Thomas's weight, each step groaning like something alive resisting his descent. His flashlight flickered against the stone walls, illuminating peeling paint and streaks of moisture that looked too much like veins. The air grew colder with every step down, dense and unmoving, as though the basement had never known fresh breath. At the bottom, the beam of light revealed a rusted door propped half open. The words etched above its frame were nearly gone, but Thomas could still make them out. Morgue. His pulse quickened. A morgue meant death, meant bodies once laid out, catalogued, and forgotten. He pushed the door gently, and the metal shrieked against the floor, echoing far too loudly in the stone chamber beyond. The morgue was cavernous. A long, rectangular room lined with metal drawers, their handles corroded, some hanging open like yawning mouths. The tile floor was cracked, and puddles of stagnant water reflected the beam of his light. In the center stood a single autopsy table, its surface still faintly stained despite the decades that he forced himself to move slowly, sweeping his light from side to side. The silence pressed hard against his ears until he almost wished for sound, even the drip of water. Then, as if answering his unspoken thought, the faintest noise rose from the far corner. A whisper, not words, not yet. Just a hush, like breath slipping through unseen teeth. He stiffened, hand tightening on the flashlight. He swung the beam toward the sound, but there was nothing, only a drawer slightly ajar, its metal frame warped. The whisper ceased instantly, as though it had retreated back inside. Thomas tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. "It's the wind," he muttered, though he knew the truth. There was no wind down here. He moved closer to the central table, noticing faint carvings etched into its steel edge. His fingers brushed across the marks, feeling the rough grooves. Letters, carved with desperation, "Still here." The words shivered through him. He stepped back, nearly stumbling into one of the open drawers. His flashlight wavered, catching glimpses of rusted scalpels scattered across the floor. As though abandoned in haste, the silence deepened again, and then, a sound that was not silence at all, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable, footsteps, not behind him. Not above him. But from within the walls themselves. Slow. Patient. As though something were pacing just out of sight, circling the room. Thomas's breath caught. He wanted to leave, but his legs refused to obey. He shone the light wildly, each sweep confirming the room was empty, and yet the steps continued, faint but steady, dragging softly across unseen ground. Then, all at once, the sound stopped. The morgue lay still again, but the air carried a new weight, thick and oppressive, as though unseen eyes lingered on him. He forced himself toward the stairwell, each step feeling heavier than the last. His light shook, catching the wall near the door. That's when he saw it. A handprint, smeared into the dust and grime, large, elongated, fingers too long to be human. And it was fresh. Thomas's chest tightened. Whatever had left it was not a memory of this place. It was here. Now, behind him, one of the drawers slammed shut with a metallic bang. He ran. Thomas burst out of the morgue, the slam of the drawer still echoing in his ears. His breath came in shallow bursts, fogging in the cold as though the air itself wanted to keep him marked. He steadied his flashlight, its trembling beam cutting across the stairwell. The way up looked endless, swallowed in shadow. But the path downward, further into the asylum's guts, yawned open like a throat. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed to climb back up, to force open a window, to escape. Yet something held him still. A weight. A pull. The asylum had wrapped itself around him, its silence, its secrets, its unseen breath on the back of his neck. He couldn't leave. Not yet. He turned toward the lower hall. The steps here were narrower, the walls closer, stone sweating with moisture. His boots sank slightly into the damp floor, each step squelching softly. It was colder here, but not the clean cold of winter, the kind that settles in places where no warmth has dared linger for decades. As he descended, the air grew heavier, pressing against his ears. Then he noticed it, faint at first, like the hum of an old radio between stations. A sound not carried by his ears, but by his bones. Whispers. At first he thought it was his own breath rebounding in the corridor. But the voices carried tone, rhythm, something foreign. They moved together, hushed, overlapping, a chorus that seemed to slide along the walls themselves. Stay, beneath, don't look back. Thomas froze, straining to hear. His flashlight beam stuttered as his hand shook, sweeping over doorways half collapsed, iron grates bent inward, and paint curling like dead skin. The whispers grew louder, not around him, but within him, as though his own skull had become their chamber. He pressed a hand to his temple, squeezing his eyes shut. "Stop," he breathed. His voice sounded fragile against theirs. The asylum answered with silence that he opened his eyes again, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement at the far end of the hall. Not a shape. Not even a shadow. More like the impression of something having just been there, like the afterimage of a figure burned into his sight that he steadied the light. Nothing. Empty corridor, still, his chest tightened. He forced himself onward. Each doorway he passed was darker than the last, the rooms beyond filled with broken gurneys, overturned chairs, straps dangling like limp arms. Some doors were sealed, paint bubbling as though heat had once licked their surface. Others gaped open, and inside he swore he saw beds still made, sheets stiff with age, waiting for occupants who never returned. Halfway down the hall, the whispers began again. Louder this time, behind you, his throat closed. Slowly, stiffly, he turned the flashlight back the way he'd come. Empty stairs, only silence, and then, a faint breath grazed the back of his neck that he spun, the light jerking wildly across the hall, but the corridor was still, only dust swirling in his beam. Yet the air tasted different now, metallic and sharp, as though rust had settled onto his tongue. The whispers shifted, no longer words, just sound, building in a low drone. Thomas staggered forward, forcing himself to keep walking. The air grew thicker, pressing into his lungs, making each breath a labor. His light flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. When it returned, the hall had changed. The doors behind him were gone. The corridor stretched endlessly forward, no branches, no exits, just the long, suffocating path, and at the far end, impossibly far, he thought he saw a single light. A faint glow, pale and steady, like a candle burning in the belly of the asylum. The whispers faded. Silence pressed in once more. Thomas stared at that distant light, his heart hammering, knowing two truths at once, that he needed to reach it, and that whatever waited there was already aware of him. The light at the far end of the endless corridor shimmered faintly, as though it wasn't entirely real. Thomas squinted, trying to steady his breath. Each inhale scraped his throat raw, and each exhale left him with the uneasy sense that the air carried something away from him, something he might need later. His boots dragged on the floor, the sound soft, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy air. He forced himself onward, step by slow step, eyes fixed on that glow. The distance never seemed to shrink. It was like walking toward a mirage. The more he moved, the farther it seemed to retreat, and then, without noticing when, he was standing before it. The glow leaked from a narrow gap in a doorframe. The wood was swollen with moisture, its paint bubbled and flaking like burned skin. A tarnished brass plate clung crookedly to the door, Ward C. The C had been scratched deep, over and over, as if something trapped inside had clawed at it with patient, endless desperation. Thomas swallowed. His mouth was dry, his tongue a stone. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The hinges groaned low and long, like some animal exhaling after years of silence. Inside, the glow filled the room. Not a candle. Not a bulb. It came from the walls themselves, faint, bluish, like phosphorescent moss spreading across peeling paint. The air shimmered faintly, and for a moment, Thomas thought he had stepped underwater. Beds lined the walls, their frames rusted, their mattresses rotted into vague lumps. Some were still strapped with leather restraints. Others sagged inward, as if something heavy had once pressed down and refused to rise again, and then he saw them. Figures. At first, he thought they were just shadows, cast by the strange glow. But the longer he looked, the more they defined themselves. Thin, translucent forms sat on the beds, heads bowed, arms slack. Patients. Dozens of them. Their outlines were smeared, indistinct, like breath fogging glass. But there was no mistaking the shapes of their bodies. The whispers returned. Not around him now, not even within his skull. They came directly from the figures. "Don't leave, we stayed when no one came back." Thomas's breath caught. He stepped backward, the heel of his boot catching on the cracked tile. His flashlight sputtered, flickered, then dimmed, until only the room's sickly glow remained. The figures began to shift. Slowly. Their heads rising. Their faces, if they could be called faces, turned toward him. Empty sockets where eyes should have been glimmered faintly with the same pale light that pulsed through the walls. One figure near the closest bed lifted a hand. Its movement was jerky, brittle, as though joints had long since stiffened. The hand reached outward, fingers trembling, as if begging, or beckoning. "Stay," it whispered, louder than the others. The words seemed to press into Thomas's chest, sinking deeper than sound should ever reach. He shook his head, stepping back again. "No," his own voice cracked, a child's protest. "I'm not supposed to." The floor groaned beneath him. The glow surged brighter. And in that brightness, he saw it, chains. Rusted lengths snaked across the floor, wrapped around bed frames, coiled into corners like sleeping serpents. They weren't attached to anything living now. But they had been once. The figures moved again, not rising from their beds, but leaning, stretching, reaching toward him with hands too thin, too long. Thomas's flashlight died, only the pale light remained, and in its steady glow, the room seemed to lean in closer around him. The walls bent, the ceiling sagged, as though the ward itself wanted to fold shut and keep him inside. He stumbled back into the hall, heart hammering, breath ragged. The door resisted as he pulled, wood swollen and heavy, but he wrenched it closed at last. The whispers muffled, though they did not vanish. They lingered behind the door, patient, endless. Thomas leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to his chest. He knew now. He hadn't been alone since the moment he stepped into this place, and something told him that the asylum wasn't just showing him its past. It was waiting to decide whether he belonged to its future. The hall stretched ahead, darker than before. Thomas's flashlight was dead, its weight in his hand now useless, but the pale glow from behind the ward door still clung faintly to his clothes, like dust that refused to shake off. He didn't trust the shadows, not anymore, yet something tugged him onward. Not curiosity. Not even fear. It was a pull, subtle but insistent, like the asylum itself wanted him to see what lay ahead. The corridor bent sharply, opening into a wider chamber. At first, it looked like another ward, but the air here was heavier, damp with a moldy paper smell. A brass plaque on the far wall leaned crooked, records and archives. Thomas hesitated. He'd seen what the asylum kept in its wards. What would it keep in its books? The door was half open, the wood warped, its hinges streaked with orange rust. He pushed through, and the stale, suffocating air hit him full in the face. The room was lined with towering shelves, most of them collapsed or rotting, spilling their contents across the floor. Yellowed pages, broken spines, patient files tied with decayed string. The smell of mildew and something sharper, iron, maybe blood, clung thick to every inch. The pale light followed him in. It shimmered faintly between the shelves, as though it wanted to show him something. Thomas stepped carefully, crunching loose glass and splintered wood underfoot. His fingers brushed along the edge of a file, and it disintegrated at his touch, flaking into pulp. But one folder held firm. Its cover was black, its label stamped deep, Dr. Holloway, Special Cases. The name struck him, though he didn't know why. He felt a twinge, a memory not quite his own. A pen scratching across paper. A door locking from the outside. Screams muffled by thick stone walls, hands trembling. He opened the file. Inside were photographs. Patients strapped to beds. Eyes wide, mouth sewn shut. Inked notes in cramped, frantic handwriting filled the margins, resistant to treatment, unresponsive to electroshock, exhibiting unnatural resilience. And then one page stood out, a drawing. Rough, hurried, made in pencil. It showed the asylum itself, from above, a crude floor plan. Every ward labeled. Every corridor mapped. At the very center, circled over and over until the paper nearly tore, were two words, lower levels. Thomas's breath hitched. He flipped the page. Another note scrawled below in red ink, the voices converge beneath. Do not enter without restraint. A sound stirred behind him, paper fluttered though there was no draft. A stack of folders spilled from a collapsed shelf as though shoved by unseen hands. The air thickened, pressing against him, pushing him back from the file, but he held on to it. Clutched it tight, because he understood now, this asylum had not been abandoned. Not truly. What had been started here hadn't ended, it had only sunk deeper, hidden in those lower levels. The pale light pulsed once, faint but urgent. It seemed almost to guide his gaze to a half-hidden stairwell at the back of the room, its iron gate half-rusted open. Beyond it, nothing but darkness, thicker than anything he had yet faced. The whispers rose again. Louder now, overlapping, pressing against his skull until he thought it would split. Stay away, don't follow, you'll never come back up. And among them, one whisper stood out, clear, deliberate, spoken not to scare him away but to draw him down. We are waiting. Thomas clutched the file tighter, his knuckles white, the paper trembling in his grip. His body wanted to turn and flee, but his legs betrayed him. Step by step, he found himself moving toward the stairwell, toward the dark that swallowed all light. The asylum had shown him its ghosts, now it was ready to show him its heart. The stairwell yawned before Thomas like the throat of some vast creature, swallowing light, swallowing sound. He stood at the top for a long moment, hand resting on the rusted gate. The air that drifted up from below was different, colder, denser, and carrying the faint, sour tang of earth long undisturbed. He wanted to believe he could turn back. That the whispering voices were warnings, not invitations. But the file in his hand felt alive, vibrating faintly with every heartbeat. The words lower level stared back at him in jagged pencil strokes, pulling him forward, step by step. He descended, the first few stairs groaned under his weight, and flakes of rust stuck to his palm from the railing. Each step seemed to stretch longer than the last. By the fifth, the voices had returned, no longer scattered, but unified. A chorus, low and rhythmic, almost like a chant. He couldn't tell if it came from below or from inside his skull. The deeper he went, the more the asylum above seemed to dissolve. The drip of water echoed faintly, though there was no water. The walls were stone here, rough-hewn, older than the rest of the building. This was no basement built for storage. This was something buried first, and the asylum had been raised over it like a lid on AJAR.AT. The landing, his breath misted. The cold bit deep now, deeper than winter air. His flashlight had been dead for hours, but a thin glow radiated faintly from the walls themselves, a phosphorescent shimmer that came and went like breath. It illuminated jagged symbols carved into the stone, repeating patterns of circles and slashes, endless rows of marks that seemed less like language and more like tally marks. That he touched one. It was fresh. The stone flaked under his finger. Someone had been here recently. The stairs opened into a long corridor. Narrow. Low ceiling. Dampness clung to the stones, beating into rivulets that ran down into cracks. And at the far end, a door. Metal. Reinforced. A single, square window cut into it, blacker than the hall around it. The file in his hands grew heavier. He flipped it open again. One of the photographs he hadn't seen before slid free, a patient's face blurred, smeared in the photo like it had moved while the picture was taken. Below it, the words scrawled in ink, bound below. "Do not release." The whispering voices surged, almost panicked now. "Don't open it, don't let it out, not again." But one voice cut through. Clear. Calm. "Close, Thomas." He froze. That IT had said his name. The voices had always been indistinct, layered, nameless. But this one knew him. It didn't echo through the hall. It came from beyond the door. From the black square window that seemed to breathe faintly in and out. That he should have run. He should have turned back up the stairs, left the file, and sealed the gate behind him. But he stepped closer. His own breathing synced with the door's pulse, in and out, shallow and unsteady. The air here smelled different, metallic, acrid, tinged with ash. His fingers hovered above the iron latch. "Thomas, we remember you." The words weren't sound. They were inside him, pressed against his skull from within. He had never been here before. He had never known this place. And yet, a part of him recoiled with recognition, as though some buried fragment of his soul had walked these halls long ago. That he placed his hand on the latch. The whispers screamed this time. Louder than ever, 1,000 voices clawing at his mind, begging him not to move it. His vision blurred. His ears rang. His knees buckled under the weight of their fury, but through it all, the calm voice persisted. "Just open it, and see." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, the file clutched so tight it cut into his hand. His heart thundered, the latch clicked, and the door began to open. The hinges screamed as the door cracked open, but the sound was muffled, as though swallowed before it could spread down the corridor. Thomas held his breath, staring into the blackness beyond. That at first, there was nothing. No movement. No light. Just a stagnant void that seemed to reach out and meet his gaze. His hand trembled on the latch, the chill of the metal sinking into his bones. That he pushed the door wider. A damp draft poured over him, heavy with dust and something far older, the scent of charred wood, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like flowers long dead. He stepped inside. The chamber was vast, much larger than the narrow corridor suggested. His footsteps echoed into the distance, overlapping with themselves in strange, delayed rhythms. The glow from the hall behind him barely reached past the threshold. Beyond it stretched an ocean of shadow, and yet, he wasn't blind. The dark here seemed alive, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Slowly, shapes began to emerge, the walls curved, circular, like the inside of a great cistern. Every surface was etched with carvings, the same tallies and slashes he'd seen on the stairwell walls, but multiplied 1,000-fold, layered over each other until they formed chaotic spirals. Some were shallow, others dug deep enough to ooze moisture. That he trailed his hand along one as he walked. The stone was slick and warm, as though it had been carved only moments before. The file slipped in his grip. He knelt to steady it, and as he did, he noticed something spread across the chamber floor. Not dust. Not stone. Ash. A thin layer of blackened powder blanketed the ground, puffing faintly with each of his steps. In the center of the chamber stood something that made his stomach clench. A chair. It was simple, wooden, its back high and narrow. Leather straps dangled from its arms and legs, frayed with age but unmistakable in their purpose. Around it, the ash thickened, as though everything here had burned but the chair itself. He circled it slowly, each step loud in the silence. His hand brushed one of the straps. It was warm. Too warm. He pulled back, the whispers pressed in again. Not panic this time. Quieter. Eager, sit, remember, you belong. Thomas staggered back, shaking his head. His breath came fast, clouding in the cold air. No, he muttered, though the words sounded weak even to him. No, I don't. The file slipped again and burst open on the floor. Papers scattered across the ash. Photographs fluttered, blurred faces, twisted figures, hallways he recognized but couldn't place. One photo slid to the chair's base. He bent to retrieve it. The image was of the chamber itself. The same walls. The same ash. And there, in the chair, a figure. Strapped down. Head slumped. Its face was obscured by a black smear, like the negative had been burned. Below the photo, in thick, uneven handwriting, it always returns. The calm voice returned, closer than before. Thomas, sit down, it's the only way. His chest tightened. The name, his name, sounded like it had been spoken by someone standing right behind him. He spun, but the chamber stretched on, empty, the door now barely visible as a pale rectangle in the far wall. He bent, snatched up the photo, and shoved it back into the file. But the file seemed heavier now, swollen, as though more pages had appeared inside. He flipped it open, and froze. The first page was no longer blank. Words had appeared in jagged pencil strokes, identical to those he'd seen before. Patient, Thomas Hale, status, returned, location, the chamber. His hands shook. He dropped the file, but the page remained imprinted in his mind. His name. His status. Returned, the whispers surged again, drowning out thought. The walls seemed to breathe, the tallies glowing faintly, shifting, reshaping into spirals that drew his gaze inward. The chair loomed larger, its leather straps curling upward like grasping hands. Sit, and remember. He staggered back toward the door. His legs felt heavy, as though the ash were trying to cling to his boots, pulling him down. The pale rectangle of the exit seemed to shrink the closer he came, and then, his shadow moved in the chair, just a twitch. A tilt of the head. A settling of weight. Thomas froze, breath caught in his throat. His eyes locked on the figure that hadn't been there before. It was seated in the chair now, strapped, its head bowed, face hidden in shadow. The straps that had hung loose moments ago now stretched taut across its wrists. We remember you. The voice was no longer calm. It was layered, dozens of voices speaking as one. It reverberated in his skull, vibrating in his chest. The figure in the chair began to lift its head. Slowly. Painfully slow, Thomas stumbled backward, heart racing, his hand fumbling blindly for the doorframe. But his fingers met only cold stone. The door was gone, the chamber had sealed itself, and the figure's face, pale, blurred, shifting, was his own. The key Daniel had found beneath the broken floor tile weighed heavier than metal should. He had carried it in his pocket for nearly a day, feeling its edges press against his leg as if reminding him it still existed, still demanded use. Tonight, with the asylum's halls unusually quiet, he stood before a door at the end of a forgotten corridor. The door wasn't like the others. Most were swollen with rot or warped by years of damp, but this one was different, iron, riveted, sealed as though meant to keep something in rather than keep visitors out. Above it, a painted sign in flaking black letters, archives. That he slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, as though something inside hadn't been turned in decades. Then, with a sound like a cough from the earth itself, the mechanism gave way, the stairwell beyond descended into darkness. Daniel clicked on his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through dust that floated like ash in the stale air. Each step downward groaned beneath his weight, the sound swallowed by the thick silence. The basement smelled of rust, mold, and something else, a sweetness, faint but wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. At the bottom, the beam of light revealed a vast storage chamber. Rusted filing cabinets leaned like broken teeth. Boxes sagged on shelves, their labels smeared into illegibility. In the center stood a desk, an old tape recorder resting on its surface, a reel still threaded and waiting that he shouldn't press play. He knew this. But his hand trembled toward the switch anyway, the tape whirred to life, crackling with static. Then a voice, weak, male, American accent. "This is patient number, God, what's the number?" "Doesn't matter. They put us down here." Said the walls were quieter underground. But it's not quiet. You hear them, don't you? Scraping, whispering, moving. They come closer every night. The voice broke into coughing. Then silence. For a moment, Daniel thought the recording had ended. But then it resumed, the tone different now, lower, strained. "If you find this, don't follow the dripping. It's not water." The tape cut out with a squeal of static. Daniel froze. Because at that very moment, he heard it, drip, drip, drip. His flashlight swept the room. No pipes here. No wet patches. The floor was dry, layered only with dust. And yet, the sound persisted, faint and rhythmic, echoing from deeper in the basement. He moved forward, unwilling, yet unable to stop himself. The cabinets grew taller, crowding in, their drawers hanging open like mouths caught mid-breath. He brushed past one, and the drawer slammed shut on its own, the clang reverberating through the chamber. The dripping grew louder. He turned a corner and found an old gurney tipped against the wall. Leather straps dangled from its sides, cracked but intact. The drip came from above it. He tilted his light upward. No pipe. No ceiling leak. Just stone. Yet in the beam of his flashlight, something shimmered, a dark stain spreading across the ceiling like veins, pulsing faintly as though alive. With each pulse, a bead formed and fell, drip, onto the gurney. Daniel staggered back, his light swinging wildly. Every file cabinet in view was trembling now, drawers rattling in unison. A low groan filled the air, not mechanical, not structural, but organic, like something huge shifting in its sleep. And then, silence. The dripping stopped. The rattling ceased. Only Daniel's own ragged breathing remained. He backed away, clutching the flashlight so tightly it hurt his hand. His shoulder brushed against another shelf, sending a stack of folders tumbling to the floor. They spilled open, papers fluttering across the dust. He bent to gather them, almost out of instinct. Each page bore the same line, written in different handwritings, different inks, over and over again. "Do not wake them." The words blurred in his vision. He dropped the papers and stumbled back toward the stairwell, his heartbeat pounding in his ears louder than the rain above. When he reached the base of the stairs, he turned for one last look. The tape recorder was running again. Its reels spun, though no one had touched them. And from the speaker, a voice he recognized, his own, echoed through the basement. "You shouldn't have come down here." Daniel bolted up the stairs, the key digging into his pocket, heavier than ever. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay in his cot inside the staff quarters, staring at the cracked ceiling while the rain whispered against the windows. Every time his eyes closed, he heard the tape recorder in his mind, his own voice telling him what he should not have done. By morning, he resolved to push it aside. The asylum was large, and he hadn't yet explored every floor. Maybe the strangeness in the basement was only his mind playing tricks, amplified by isolation and exhaustion. He clung to that thought as if it were a rope keeping him tethered to sanity. But as the day wore on, he noticed something new. The halls felt watched, every corner seemed to hold a weight, every doorway carried the sense of an unseen presence. He caught himself glancing at shadows too often, convinced they moved against the angle of light. By late afternoon, as storm clouds thickened and the halls dimmed, he made his way toward the western wing. Few doors there opened, most warped shut by years of water damage. But one had been left ajar, its brass plaque read, "Attendant's Office." He pushed inside. The room was small, walls lined with cabinets, a single desk in the center. Everything smelled of mildew, but beneath that was something sharper, antiseptic, faint but fresh, as though someone had cleaned recently. That shouldn't have been possible. He stepped closer to the desk. An open logbook lay across it, pages yellowed with age. He ran his finger over the ink. The last entry read, "Patient remains compliant. Voices reported during night watch. Increased dosage. No date. No signature. Just words, sharp and steady, as though the pen had been lifted minutes ago." Daniel turned. His flashlight beam grazed across the wall, and froze. A shadow stretched long across the plaster, distorted and thin. Not his OWN. Stood at the far side of the room, motionless. The shape of a man in uniform, broad shoulders, cap tilted forward, but there was no body casting it. Just the shadow, darker than the dim light should allow. He backed away, pulse quickening. The shadow didn't move. Not at first. But then, with a slowness that churned his stomach, the head tilted. The angle was deliberate. Watching him, Daniel whispered into the emptiness, "Who's there?" The room held its breath, then, so faint he almost doubted it, a reply. A man's voice, low, roughened by age or wear. "You don't belong here." The shadow lifted its arm. The gesture was small, but Daniel recognized it. It was pointing to the logbook on the desk. He swallowed hard and turned back. The logbook was different now. Where there had been one line, there were dozens, filling the page, words crowding the margins. His flashlight shook as he read, "Patient remains compliant. Patient remains compliant. Patient remains compliant." Over and over, the sentence repeated, written in the same precise hand. But near the bottom, the words changed. Patient escaped. Patient is in the halls. Patient is watching. Daniel's breath hitched. The shadow moved again. Not walking, not shifting, but stretching. Its limbs elongated along the walls, sliding toward him like stains spreading in water. The head remained fixed, tilted, eyes invisible yet burning into him. Panic surged. He grabbed the logbook, slamming it shut, as if the act could erase the words. When he looked up, the shadow was gone. The wall was bare, but the room no longer felt empty. He could hear breathing. Slow. Steady. Not his own. The flashlight flickered. Darkness swallowed the corners of the office. For an instant, Daniel thought he saw movement beside the desk, just out of reach of light, a figure standing where no one had stood. But when the beam steadied, the corner was empty. He stumbled back into the hallway, clutching the logbook against his chest, his heart hammering. The corridor outside was dim, rain leaking through broken windows, wind sighing through cracks, but he wasn't alone. As he turned toward the main hall, the shadows along the walls seemed thicker, clustering, leaning toward him. Each step he took, they followed, stretching, lengthening, always at the edge of vision. When he finally reached his quarters, he slammed the door, locking it, shoving a chair against the handle like a child afraid of monsters. He sat on the cot, the logbook trembling in his hands. The cover was blank. No title, no markings. But when he opened it again, the first page bore a line scrawled in ink so dark it seemed wet. "You belong to the ward now." Daniel dropped the book. His lamp flickered once, twice, then steadied, but the chair pressed against the door shifted, just slightly, as though something on the other side had pushed. The storm returned with fury that night. Rain lashed against the asylum's tall windows, thunder rolled so close it rattled the bed frame beneath Daniel, and the entire building seemed to groan under the weight of wind that he hadn't dared to sleep. The logbook lay shut on the desk across from his cot, but even closed, it felt alive. He could almost hear it breathing in the dark, whispering with every clap of thunder. At last, he rose, driven less by bravery than by desperation. The western wing had shown him the shadow. The basement had given him whispers. But the asylum was vast, and some part of him thought, if I see enough of it, maybe I'll understand it. Maybe then it will let me go. So he lit his lantern and made his way toward the upper floors. The stairwell moaned under his weight, each step slick with damp. When he reached the second landing, he noticed something strange. The windows here were intact. Unlike the shattered panes below, these were sealed tight, the glass stained with decades of grime. Yet as the lightning flashed, he thought he saw silhouettes moving on the other side. Daniel pressed close, wiping a circle into the grime with his sleeve. Beyond the glass, he expected to see the storm. Instead, he saw a corridor, lit faintly, walls lined with doors, stretching into darkness. Not the outside world, but another hallway. He blinked, breath fogging the pane. It wasn't a reflection, his own lantern light didn't appear. No. This was different. Real. A sound rose beneath the howl of the storm, soft knocking. Not from the hall he stood in, but from within the window. 3 measured raps, knock. 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 The figures in the glass grew sharper now, though the grime resisted his gaze. Shapes of patients in old gowns, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They walked slowly, endlessly, down the mirrored corridor. Some turned their heads toward him, their lips moved, but he could hear nothing. Then another flash of lightning, and the glass cracked. A long fissure spread across the pane like a wound. Cold air seeped through, though the hallway beyond remained untouched by storm. Daniel staggered back. His lantern shook, flame flickering. That was when he saw the reflection, not in the window, but behind him. In the glass corridor, among the endless patients, one stood apart. A tall man in an attendant's uniform, cap low, shoulders squared. His shadow stretched unnaturally long, bleeding into the floor. The same presence from the office. The attendant, the figure raised its hand, slow, deliberate, and pressed it to the inside of the glass. The pane quivered beneath the weight. Daniel's instinct screamed. He dropped the lantern. Flame hissed against wet stone, plunging the stairwell into darkness, but in the dark, the knocking grew louder. Not 3 raps now, but a steady pounding, hands, fists, palms, slamming against the glass from the other side, dozens of them. The patients in the mirrored corridor pressed forward, faces flattening against the pane, mouths opening in silent screams. The crack widened, splintering outward, the glass straining against their weight. Daniel stumbled backward down the steps, tripping, scraping his hands raw. Then, silence. The pounding stopped. The storm outside roared on, thunder crashing, but the window was still. He dared a glance upward. The glass was whole again. No crack. No figures. Just grime and rain, but his heart knew what he'd seen. He didn't run. Running felt dangerous, as though it would wake something that only pretended to sleep. Instead, he descended step by step, hands trembling, until he returned to the first floor. His quarters felt smaller that night. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. He curled on the cot, clutching his knees, listening as rain swept over the asylum roof. But even through the storm, he could hear it, faint, distant, yet unmistakable. Knock. Knock. Knock, coming not from the windows this time, but from the inside of his own door. The rain eased by morning, leaving the asylum wrapped in a heavy, wet silence. Mist clung to the grounds outside, creeping through cracks in the broken walls. Daniel hadn't slept. His eyes burned, his skin clammy, his nerves raw, but he knew he couldn't stay still. The knocking on his door had stopped just before dawn, but the echo of it lived in his bones. He needed to move, to distract himself, to see. That was how he found himself standing before the infirmary. The door was half open, hanging crooked on its hinges. Dust coated the floor inside, except for a narrow trail, footprints, recent, leading inward. Daniel crouched. The prints were small, too small for a man. A woman, maybe. Or a child. The lantern flame wavered as he stepped inside. Rows of metal-framed beds stretched into shadow, their mattresses long rotted, springs poking through like ribs. White curtains hung between them, stained yellow with age, fluttering slightly though no wind stirred. Bottles of medicine, syringes, and cracked porcelain basins littered the counters, but what made him stop was the light, overhead. In the far corner of the room, one of the long fluorescent tubes flickered. Pale blue, buzzing faintly. Impossible. There was no electricity here. He hadn't seen a working bulb in the entire asylum, and yet, there it was that he moved closer, footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the tile. The closer he came, the stronger the buzzing grew, almost like a swarm of bees trapped inside the glass. As he reached the lit bed, he froze. The curtain was drawn, shadowed. And against it was the clear outline of someone sitting upright. A patient, thin shoulders hunched forward, head bent, arms resting in their lap. Perfectly still, except for a faint rise and fall, breathing. Daniel's throat went dry. Hello. His voice cracked in the stale air. The shadow didn't move. He reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the curtain. His hand shook so badly the hooks rattled against the frame. Then, with one sharp pull, he drew it back. The bed was empty. No patient. No body, but the mattress was indented, as though someone had just been sitting there moments before. The sheets were still creased, still warm. The buzzing above him grew louder. The fluorescent bulb pulsed with blinding light, then dimmed. Pulsed again, dimmed. Like a heartbeat, Daniel stepped back, chest tight, when he noticed something on the mattress. A notebook. Smaller than the ward log he'd found earlier, its cover scuffed leather, pages yellowed. He opened it. Inside were careful notes, written in an elegant hand. Patient observations, dates, symptoms. All the entries ended the same way: patient refuses to sleep. Over and over, the line repeated. Dozens of patients, all unable, or unwilling, to close their eyes. The last entry chilled him most. The ward itself keeps them awake. When they dream, it calls. When they resist, it watches. I can hear the attendant pacing outside my office, though I've locked the door. Daniel snapped the notebook shut. His pulse hammered in his ears. A sudden clang rang out at the far end of the infirmary. One of the beds had tipped over, crashing against the tile. Curtains swayed violently now, though no wind moved, and in that chaos, the light overhead steadied. The buzzing stopped. Daniel turned toward it just as the bulb went out, plunging the infirmary into absolute darkness. A breath brushed against his ear, not his. A voice, whispering low, deliberate, as though a doctor giving orders, stay awake. The infirmary's darkness clung to him like a second skin. Daniel didn't wait to see if the whisper would return. He bolted, lantern swinging wildly, the flame guttering with each desperate stride. The stairwell welcomed him only with its stale air and damp walls, but his mind replayed what he'd seen: the shadow on the curtain, the indented sheets, the notebook's final line. When they dream, it calls. Something inside the asylum did not want its patients to sleep. Or perhaps, it didn't want them to wake. the staircase leading down to the basement spiraled tighter than he expected, each step groaning under his weight. The further he went, the colder it grew. His breath fogged the air, drifting upward like pale smoke. The lantern flame flickered in warning as he reached the bottom. Before him stretched a heavy steel door, its surface rusted, flaking, streaked with something darker. Above it, stenciled letters barely legible read, "Archives." Daniel set his hand to the wheel latch. It resisted, stiff with age, until it gave way with a shriek that echoed up the stairwell like a dying animal. The smell hit him first. Paper rotted in dampness, ink turned metallic, mildew baked into the air. He gagged, pressing the crook of his arm against his nose. Still, he pressed forward. Rows of shelves loomed on either side, taller than a man, stretching endlessly into gloom. Some sagged under the weight of collapsing boxes. Others had fallen entirely, their contents spilled across the floor like bones from a grave that he picked his way through, boots crunching over broken folders and warped photographs. His lantern illuminated fragments, black and white portraits of patients staring blankly into the camera, medical charts marked with red stamps, staff rosters with names neatly crossed out. The deeper he went, the heavier the silence grew. Not just quiet, oppressive silence, as though the air itself absorbed every sound. Even his breathing seemed muffled, wrong, and then he saw it at the far end of the aisle stood a table. On it lay a massive, leather-bound ledger. Unlike everything else, it looked untouched by decay, its surface clean, corners sharp, the clasp gleaming as though recently polished. Daniel approached slowly, dread gnawing his stomach. He set the lantern beside it, hands trembling as he unfastened the clasp. The book fell open with surprising ease. Every page was filled with names, patient names, each accompanied by a date of admittance, a diagnosis, a treatment plan. Then, a final column, outcome, some read transferred. Others, deceased, but many more bore the same single word, written in bold, identical script, awake. Daniel's throat closed. He flipped through faster, searching, scanning. Every 10th page or so, the ink shifted, scrawled handwriting instead of neat records. Notes that bled desperation. They beg for rest, but the ward denies it. The attendant circles when the lights go out. One by one, the patients vanish into the basement. Daniel's fingers froze on a final entry, written in jagged lines, "If you find this, you are already in the records. Do not sleep. The ward will write your name next." The lantern flame sputtered that he looked down at the page again. At the very bottom, beneath the last patient entry, a fresh line had appeared, his name, Daniel Hale, status, awake. The lantern went out, from the blackness rose the sound of papers shifting, thousands of pages fluttering in unison, as though stirred by an unseen hand. Then came the scraping of the steel door closing behind him, locking him in, and finally, the sound low and deliberate, moving between the shelves, footsteps. The storm had grown heavier outside, but Daniel barely noticed anymore. The walls of the ward seemed to breathe with him, each inhale carrying the damp musk of mildew and dust, each exhale echoing through the corridor like the sigh of something alive. He moved slowly, flashlight in hand, the beam trembling as though afraid to illuminate what waited ahead. Every door he passed, old patient rooms, sealed shut with rusted locks, seemed to lean forward, listening. Behind one, he thought he heard a cough. Behind another, the scraping of a chair dragged slowly across the floor. He paused, but the noises died when he stopped. The ward wanted him moving. The deeper he went, the more the signs grew impossible to ignore. A wheelchair rolled gently out of a doorway and stopped in the middle of the hall. The beam of his flashlight caught the old leather seat, cracked and worn, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. His breath clouded in the cold air, though the ward itself felt oddly warm. as though it had trapped years of human suffering inside its walls. Then came the voice, Daniel. Just his name, whispered, yet somehow spoken directly into his ear. He spun, but the hall behind him was empty. Only peeling paint and flickering ceiling light stretching into the dark that he pressed forward. At the end of the corridor stood a figure, motionless, waiting. The beam of his flashlight wavered over it, white uniform, cap, an old-fashioned hospital attendant's garb. The man's head was tilted slightly, as though studying Daniel with clinical detachment. His face was pale, the features blurred by distance, but his eyes were a fixed black shine that seemed to absorb all light. The attendant, Daniel, froze. His body screamed to turn back, but his legs betrayed him, carrying him closer as though drawn by invisible strings. The figure did not move, did not blink. Only when Daniel reached within a few feet did the attendant finally raise a hand. A gesture, not threatening, not welcoming. Simply, inevitable. You've walked the ward long enough, the voice said, though the figure's lips barely moved. Your shift begins. Daniel shook his head. His throat was dry, but he forced words out. I don't belong here. The attendant's expression did not change. Every patient says the same. The hallway groaned. Lights flickered overhead, shadows stretching long and skeletal against the walls. Doors that had been locked now rattled violently, as if unseen hands battered from within. A chorus of low moans drifted through the air, swelling until Daniel could barely hear his own thoughts. The attendant stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Daniel tried to step back, but his spine pressed against the cold wall. He was cornered. Do you hear them? The attendant asked softly, tilting his head toward the doors. They remember you. They've been waiting for you. I don't know them, Daniel whispered, though some part of him, buried deep, felt the words ring hollow. The attendant leaned closer, the scent of antiseptic and rot clinging to him like a second skin. You will. And with that, every door on the corridor burst open at once. Shapes spilled into the hall, pale and indistinct, their faces smudged as though erased by memory. Patients without names, without voices, yet every one of them turned their gaze toward Daniel. Their mouths opened, not in screams, but in a long, collective sigh. The sound of resignation. The sound of endless nights in the ward. The attendant's hand settled on Daniel's shoulder, heavy and cold as stone. It is your turn to care for them, he said. Your shift begins now. The flashlight slipped from Daniel's hand, clattering to the floor. The beam rolled across the cracked tiles, illuminating the shadows that closed in from all sides, and then, with a final flicker, the light went out. The darkness was complete. For a moment, Daniel felt weightless, as if the floor beneath him had vanished and he was drifting through endless night. The sighing chorus of the patient still filled the air, though now it seemed to come from inside his chest, his own breath tangled with theirs. When the light returned, it wasn't from his flashlight. It was from the ceiling. A single, sterile beam clicked on above him, humming faintly. The ward around him had changed. No longer broken and abandoned, it was pristine. Fresh white paint. Waxed floors that gleamed. The scent of antiseptic so sharp it stung his nose. The patients were gone. The attendant stood alone before him, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. You've adjusted quickly, the attendant said, making a note on the paper without looking up. Some resist. Some scream. You comply. Daniel's voice felt small in the silence. I didn't choose this. The attendant finally looked at him, eyes as dark and bottomless as before. No one chooses the ward. The ward chooses them. A door materialized at the far end of the corridor. Bright light leaked through its edges, warm, golden, unlike the harsh fluorescence above. It looked like freedom. Discharge. Daniel's pulse quickened. He moved toward it, every step echoing on the spotless tiles. But as he approached, the attendant's voice followed him. You may leave, but you must understand. Daniel froze. Understand what? The attendant closed the clipboard and tucked it under his arm. His face was calm, almost kind. That once you've walked these halls, you never truly leave them. The ward travels with you. In mirrors. In silence. In dreams. The golden light from the door pulsed, brighter, beckoning him. Daniel reached for the handle, cold brass beneath his fingers. He pulled it open. The world outside was not freedom. It was the same ward, not pristine this time, but ruined again. Walls split with cracks, paint peeled, air heavy with mildew. The golden glow vanished. Only shadows remained. The attendant's voice whispered behind him, though Daniel dared not turn. Discharge is only a word. You are here until the end of your shift. The sighing chorus rose again, low, endless, hopeless. Daniel stepped backward, the door slamming shut on its own. He was trapped in the ward, as countless others had been before. His flashlight flickered on the floor beside him, though he hadn't touched it. The beam pointed down the hall, illuminating a new row of doors that hadn't been there before. Each one bore a single plaque, names Daniel recognized, his own included. The last sound he heard before the light died again was the scratch of a pen, the attendant completing a note on his clipboard, and then, silence. And so ends the Asylum Ward. A story not of escape, but of entrapment, where sleep offers no discharge, only a longer shift in the ward's endless night. There are coastlines where the sea talks in numbers, and old radios still know the grammar. On a fog-bright cliff in Nova Scotia, a retired Coast Guard operator accepts one last winter watch at a decommissioned lighthouse. He brings thermos, logbook, and the practiced calm of someone who has heard panic soften under protocol. The night promises routine, rain on glass, a foghorn, the low comfort of equipment breathing. Then, beneath the static, a distress call repeats without weather, date, or origin, clear, formal, impossible. He answers by habit. The fog thickens by degrees. The voice returns, grateful. From decades ago, the road ended without flourish, as if the land itself had decided it had gone far enough. Gravel gave way to slick rock, and beyond the hood of the truck the Atlantic wore the color of iron. The fog was not a wall but a substance, soft and deliberate, rolling over the cliff tops and settling into every groove in the earth. Thomas Hale shut off the engine and, for a moment, simply listened. The coastal air was all familiar voices, rain tapping at metal seams, wind skimming the lighthouse rail, a low-lidded foghorn moaning from somewhere just beyond sight. Underneath, steady and patient, came the hum of old circuitry from the radio shack. It was like hearing an old friend clear his throat. That he took the thermos from the passenger seat, the logbook from under it, and the small canvas pouch that held pencils, a grease pencil, and a pair of battered headphones. The pouch had gone with him to storms and calms, day shifts and graveyards. Its zipper had a mild reluctance in cold weather, a quirk Thomas knew as intimately as a colleague's cough. The lighthouse stood in the mist with a stubborn kind of dignity. The paint had faded, the railing was combed with rust, but the structure itself had the compact strength of things built to take weather as an argument and answer it by standing. The radio shack, bolted to the base like a child's boxy drawing, glowed faintly in its window. Still alive, he murmured, and the thought was kind. Inside, the air smelled of salt, machine oil, and paper that had absorbed years of damp. Thomas set his thermos down on the console and unsnapped the pouch. The equipment was older than what he'd used in Halifax in his last decade, but it had been well kept. Banks of dials, toggle switches with a fatigue-polished sheen, a receiver that wore its age like a uniform that he flipped the mains. The lights came up in a shy sequence, a few indicators stuttering before finding their glow. The receiver found its low hum, a note between sleep and waking. Thomas adjusted volume and squelch with hands that remembered the feel before the motion. Small things are learned forever when they're learned in bad weather. The notice in his pocket had called this a temporary winter watch, a favor asked because he'd once been the kind of operator who did not lose his head. The new systems handled nearly everything now, but someone, somewhere, still kept the old chain patched together through winter. Sometimes it was just easier to have a person with a logbook and patience sit near the bones and make sure the bones were not yet bones that he dated the page and wrote with tidy, square letters, 20:14, on watch. Fog present, light rain. Barometer steady. All equipment operational. Test transmissions clear. Station secure. He capped the pen and listened, head angled slightly, the way a man does when he's waiting for a kettle to think about boiling. The static had a grain he liked. It wasn't empty. It was full of the small, ongoing weather of the world, minute pops, soft cloth tears of drift, the occasional fishbone flick of interference. People imagine silence as a blank sheet. Radio men know it's a fabric that he made a slow round of the station, not because he doubted the place but because the body liked to have something simple to do. The lantern room was a round cage of glass washed in milky fog, the lens asleep under its cover. He ran a finger along the rim of a sill, came away with a powder of salt. Down again, past the narrow bed and the coil of rope someone had failed to put away right. He coiled it properly and felt himself breathe easier. Back at the console, he poured coffee. It steamed up into the small space and mingled with old paper, and the smell, clean bitterness over salt, was its own weather. He lifted the headphones, paused, and set them down again. Not yet. The room itself was a pair of headphones big enough for the sea. The first hour passed gently. He logged a routine weather notice from a distant station, a fishing vessel checking in with the kind of warmth that belongs to voices that have learned not to waste their heat. He responded with the steady calm his own instructors had insisted was the nature of life-saving. You borrow your calm from the future and spend it in the storm. The foghorn cried once, then was quiet. In the pause that followed, the rain found a new rhythm, a little slower, as if the storm were deciding whether to go to bed or pace the hall. Thomas stretched his fingers and flexed his neck. He had a sailor's posture still, back straight not from pride but from necessity. The body likes to remember what kept it alive. That he checked the generator, noted the fuel reserve, wiped a film of condensation from a panel with the edge of his sleeve. When he came back to the chair, he pulled the headphones on and let the cushion settle around his ears with the small sigh of things that fit. The world narrowed. The shack's hum dropped away, the rain became memory, and the band opened like a dark room you step into after daylight, nothing urgent. A harbor call, a board exchange, a bit of weather surveying the idea of itself in language. He idled there, moving in increments a degree or two to favor clarity over familiarity, the way you turn your head to hear a voice better at a long table that he did not expect, no one would, to hear anything more than that. This was a relic post stitched into winter so that the chart could say there was still a person here. A presence you could reach if the new lights went dark. Half an hour later, as the rain trimmed itself even finer and the fog pressed softly on the glass, the static shifted in a way his bones recognized but his mind did not name. He had been in storms where a tone bent that exact way right before something came through. He adjusted the squelch. The sound did not sharpen. It grew, organized. The hairs along his forearms lifted as if the room had cooled a degree. That he lifted the headphones slightly, checking whether it was the room or the band. The room was the steady hush of rain and old electricity. The band was gathering itself. He eased the phones back down. A fragment surfaced, washed through by noise, a contour of syllables without words. He did not call it a voice. Not yet. He listened in the simple, respectful way that is the job. If it wanted to be heard, it would choose how. He glanced at the logbook and, without looking away from the band, turned the page ready for a fresh line. The foghorn sounded, far off, not warning so much as telling a story it had told before. Thomas adjusted the volume by the smallest degree, a gesture like smoothing a sheet, and let the room, the rain, and the receiver become one soft field. Nothing urgent, he told himself, and wrote it down as if writing could make it true. 21:07, routine traffic. Fog persistent. Receiver stable. Monitoring, the static rippled, almost conversational. He waited. The hour bent itself quietly, the way time does when there are no clocks but the sound of your own breathing. Thomas had settled deeper into the chair, thermos half drained, the warmth spreading through him like the remembered weight of a wool blanket. He was not drowsy, not yet, but there was a softening. The kind of readiness that comes not from nerves, but from patience. The receiver's static was even. Then it wasn't. It began as a hesitation, the smallest thinning of sound. A thread pulled from a weave. His hand moved automatically, volume back a touch, squelch forward, listening for the shape beneath the noise. He had done this thousands of times before, in stations where the walls shook with storm and the air smelled of ozone. This was calmer, almost polite. The signal cut once, returned, and then came clear enough to place words around. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is the trawler Marigold, position off Sable Island, engines failed, taking water, requesting immediate assistance. The voice was crisp, almost textbook. The way you practiced in drills before the cold water climbed your chest. A man's voice, mid-range, carrying the edge of formality that meant he was holding himself steady. Thomas sat forward. His hand went to the logbook, pen uncapped, the act so ingrained it required no thought. He wrote as he listened, letters quick but neat. 21:23, distress call, vessel Marigold, reporting engine failure near Sable Island. Coordinates incomplete. He reached for the transmitter, thumb brushing the worn edge of the toggle. Station North Point receiving. Repeat position, over. His voice came low, calm, the kind of tone bred by decades of training. For a moment, only static answered. The sort of pause that makes you lean closer without realizing. Then the voice returned, identical in pitch and cadence. Mayday, Mayday, this is the trawler Marigold. Engines failed, taking water. Position. It broke into static again. Thomas noted it, marking the time, the weather, the partial words. His pencil did not hesitate. The act of writing steadied the room. He leaned closer, adjusted frequency, felt the chair creak beneath him. Station North Point requesting repeat of coordinates. Do you copy, Marigold? Over. This time, silenced. He sat back, hand still resting on the transmitter. The foghorn called once more in the distance, the sound carrying through the walls like a reminder that the world outside continued its own watch. Thomas did what the manual always instructed. He waited. 3 minutes. 5. Listening for repeat signals, scanning adjacent bands in case the transmission drifted. His breathing was even, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a man who knew the difference between interference and intent. Finally, he wrote, no repeat. Transmission terminated. Monitoring channels. He capped the pen slowly, as if giving the silence permission to hold. The storm outside had not changed. The fog lay heavy, the rain traced the glass in tired lines. But inside the radio band, the air seemed colder, not ominous. Not yet. Just the way an empty room feels when you know someone has just left it. Thomas let the room settle around the absence of the voice, the way snow smooths over footprints you aren't sure you saw. The receiver's hush returned to its steady weave. He set the headphones down, not because he needed distance but because the act of placing them carefully on the desk was part of the ritual that kept a man's mind level, protocol first. Always that he slid the logbook a hand's width higher on the desk and opened the steel cabinet beside the console. Inside, the shelves held binders with their spines softened by years, frequency charts, buoy bulletins, an old vessel index with tabs faded from red to the color of dried tea. The room's light made a warm rectangle on the paper, rain tracing its thin fingers across the window. Beyond that he took out the vessel index and set it flat. The sound it made, cloth and card together, a small, dignified exhale, belonged to libraries and chart rooms and places where people had agreed to be careful. He turned to M, running his finger down lines of names that had been boats and lives and seasons. There were several marigolds, there always were. Names returned to the water the way birds return to a roof. They know that he scanned for region, length, home port. A marigold out of Lunenburg years back, decommissioned. Another, smaller, registered as a coastal handliner out of Shelburne. A third, faint pencil notes italicizing the entry, status unknown. No call sign written, just a penciled mark where the number might have been. It wasn't proof of anything. Paper has gaps where weather got in. He closed the index without forcing it, then set it aside and pulled the frequency binder closer. Channel 16, distress and calling, he was already monitoring. His fingers found the old laminated quick sheet anyway, as if the body liked the reassurance of touching the map even when you knew the road by heart. That he keyed the transmitter briefly, a routine check sent across the net, the kind that floats without troubling anyone. Station active, monitoring, weather calm. The reply came back from a distant voice with the friendly indifference of late night, acknowledged, all clear. No other stations reporting Mayday traffic on 16. Thomas thanked them, signed as protocol required, and let the band breathe again. That he listened to the weather instead, because weather tells truth even when memory does not. Barometer steady. Rain lightning to a sift rather than a pour. Wind veering in small polite degrees, enough to tap a different rhythm under the eaves. The foghorn did not speak. The sea, when it is honest, has nothing to say. Back to the logbook, he added the check, the reply, the note that no corroborating traffic had been heard. Then he drew a light line between entries, a habit learned from an old instructor who'd said, quietly in a room that smelled like this one, leave the future a place to land. He opened a narrow drawer beneath the console and brought out the compact recorder, older, yes, but loyal, with a brandless face and a toggle that never pretended to be new. He threaded in a fresh cassette from its paper sleeve, pressed the red button till it clicked and glowed. If the voice returned, there would be a witness with a better memory than his. Thomas adjusted the receiver by half a breath to favor the exact place where the earlier words had seemed to rise. Marigold, he thought, rolling the syllables idly, not as a superstition but because names have a way of making a space in the air. He kept his hands folded, the way he did when he knew that fidgeting would only stir sediment in clear water. Minutes found their work. The station had a small way of being companionable, its modest sounds, its faithful hum. In the lantern room above, a droplet marched down a pane and disappeared into the frame. Somewhere in the wall, a wire ticked once, cooling. Thomas let his breathing match the rain's gradual easing. That he considered the message content with the same slow patience he'd brought to storm nights. Engines failed. Taking water. A request made by someone who remembered how to shape the call as if reading from a card in the dark. There should have been coordinates. There are always coordinates, even when they're guessed. There should have been a call sign. There should have been urgency nibbling at the corners of the voice, the way salt finds any crack in paint. Instead, the tone had been clean, measured. Not unfeeling, disciplined that he pulled the index again, rechecked the marigold entries as if they might have rearranged in his absence. The pencil note by status unknown did not become clearer for being asked. He searched the back for an appendix of retired vessels, the lists of names that had slipped from current use into the gentle hinterland of memory. No marigold there that matched a steel trawler of the sort that would be calling off Sable in winter. He glanced at the clock as a courtesy to time, then away again. In work like this, clocks are suggestions. The true measure is how the room feels. That he cued the recorder's tape back 5 seconds, then let it roll, a low murmur under the static, capturing what might not return. A second cassette waited by the console like a spare lantern wick. Rain softened further, trading drips for a whisper you only notice when you forget to listen for it. The fog lay against the glass without need of explanation. Thomas cupped the headphones over one ear, leaving the other open to the room, an old habit that made the night feel present rather than remote. That he let memory bring him to other shifts, storms where men shouted to be heard over their own fear, calm dawns when a simple good morning from a boat you'd worried about carried the weight of a holiday. He had found that the sea is a better listener than a speaker. But when it does speak, it uses the voices we give it, the wires, the waves, the small brave radios. That he made a new line on the page, left it blank a moment, then filled it with what he could say without decoration. 2211, equipment verified, channels monitored. No corroborating distress observed. Recorder active. Weather improving. Station secure. He set the pen down. A light clink sounded from somewhere behind the wall, water easing from one place to another, the building taking a breath. He did not turn. He did not need a reason to believe in houses settling or pipes deciding their business in winter. The easy rustle of the place was part of its kindness. On the band, a tremor. A brush of shape. He leaned no farther than comfort allowed, fine-tuned the squelch by a fraction, and held still. The recorder's small red eye watched with him. Static assembled itself, then stepped back, like someone clearing their throat in a doorway they hadn't intended to enter. Words nearly formed, then did not. Thomas's hand hovered near the transmitter. He did not key it. There is a wisdom in allowing the other party to decide the terms of conversation. The room seemed to cool again, the way it had before. He did not move to the heater. He let the cool be part of the listening. Nothing came. Not for a minute. Not for 5. He poured what was left of the thermos into the lid and held it without drinking, palms warming. He imagined a boat in clear weather announcing trouble as if reading from a manual written when radios had valves instead of boards. He imagined an operator past fear and into the narrow, bright corridor of procedure. He imagined the past finding a path through fog because the fog is, after all, only another kind of air. He smiled at the thought, not because it was comforting but because it had the neatness of a good knot that he drank. The coffee had gone from hot to honest. He placed the lid back on the thermos with the small twist that keeps a thing from feeling finished. He drew another line on the page, a quiet rule under his own calm. When the voice returned, it did so with a courtesy that felt like an answer to patience. The same pitch, the same careful cadence, words rounded as if by long practice. This is the trawler Marigold. Engines failed, taking water. Position. Static lifted the rest away like a tide departing a footprint. Thomas keyed the transmitter this time, not abruptly but with the composure a night deserves. Station North Point receiving. Marigold, confirm number of souls on board. Do you copy? Over. He waited as one does at a bedside for someone to wake in their own time, the band filled with soft blankness. Then, where coordinates should have been, where numbers should have comforted the world with their crispness, came something else, the measured click of a microphone keyed by a steady hand, and, impossibly, a second tone behind the voice, as if another radio in another room had answered also. Not an echo. Not feedback. A harmony of intention that he did not speak. He let the recorder do its work. The fog pressed closer to the glass as if it preferred to listen from near at hand. When at last he made an entry, he kept it short, because short is what you write when you intend to keep listening. 22:29, repeat of distress, no coordinates given. Inquiry sent. Unusual secondary tone concurrent with transmission. Monitoring. Recorder active. He turned the page and left it open. The night, like a careful guest, would fill it if it wished. The weather made up its mind toward kindness. Rain thinned until it was less a fall than a presence, a fine veil that the wind barely troubled. The fog, faithful to its work, held steady against the glass, but the pressure eased a notch, the way a hand loosens on a railing when the deck finds its balance. Thomas noted it with the satisfaction of a craftsman. 22:41, barometer rising. Precipitation light. Visibility within station unchanged. He drew a short line after the words, routine can be a lullaby. He listened, nothing arrived in a hurry. The band had settled into its soft, granular hush. He let his attention rest without narrowing. He had learned long ago that listening too hard is a way of scaring off the very thing you're waiting for. Better to make room, the recorders read. I watched the room with its mild patience. Thomas adjusted its position a little, the way one straightens a picture, not because it will fall if left crooked, but because the body thinks better when the world is squared. He thought of the tone behind the voice, no echo, not feedback, a second sound with its own intention. He had heard generators make music of their own, had known the sympathetic song of two engines hitting the same note on a calm night. But this was closer than machinery and less argumentative than interference. It felt like a door propped half open by a book that he chose to be practical. Practical often invites the extraordinary the way politeness invites confidences. The shack had its own small atmospheres, the overhead strip light with its thin, steady buzz, the little refrigerator tucked under a shelf, humming when its motor woke, the convection heater sighing warm along the baseboard, the desk lamp that gave a circle of yellow gentler than the strip. It was a good room, generous with its noises, but he wondered, without urgency, what would happen if he gave the band a little more quiet to work with. He set his hand to the overhead switch and clicked the strip dark. The buzz died, the room leaned into the lamp's low circle. He wrote, 22:44, overhead off to reduce electrical noise. Monitoring for clarity. It was not strictly necessary to log such things, but it cost nothing, and the future likes knowing why you did what you did. He listened again. The static changed in personality, not in volume, a shade more articulate, as if the little grains had been combed. He smiled, small, private, at the old pleasure of hearing a difference you could not have described to anyone who had not spent years in the same chairs. He unplugged the refrigerator. A modest click, a silence that was not silence filling the space where the motor's intention had been. He sat, placed the headphones over one ear free, and let the air quieten further inside his head. This is the trawler Marigold. The voice arrived like a line dropped neatly from a hand that knew the throw. Not louder, closer. The secondary tone came with it, not as a companion but as a condition, a thin, constant thread at the edge of hearing. He did not key the transmitter at once. He let the sentence finish itself of its own accord, the way you let a person choose their own pace down a staircase. Engines failed, taking water. Position. Silence took the coordinates place as easily as sleep takes the last word of a bedtime story. He marked the time. He did not write a conclusion. He turned the heater one notch lower. The room cooled by less than a thought, but the small fan let its breath go still. He cupped his hands together in his lap to discourage fidgeting. Across the window, a droplet considered whether to fall. then decided against it. Station North Point receiving, he said, almost a murmur. Calm as a bridge and a blanket both. Marigold, confirm persons on board. Do you copy? Over. Static. Patience. The recorder's eye a single ember, 3 souls, the voice said. Without hurry, the number settled into the room as if it had been there all along, waiting to be named. Thomas nodded once, to no one, as if acknowledging that the sea had given him a straightforward thing. He wrote, 2247, 3 souls aboard, received clearly. No coordinates. Secondary tone present. He drew a line under the entry, not a separation but a small ceremony that he found that the more the room agreed to be quiet with him, the more the voice chose to answer rather than repeat. It was a simple observation, the kind you trust because it asks nothing complicated of you. He rose and crossed to the panel where the generator controls were set plainly for a man to see and not mistake. Running steady, all within parameters. He did not shut it down, no one but a fool would, but he did what the manual allowed for short winter intervals. He transferred the shack's interior circuits to battery for a 10-minute test. He logged the start time, the expected battery draw, the safety limits. Then he closed the panel gently, the way one closes a good book between paragraphs. The room changed in that small way that is not drama but is real, withdrawing like a tide. The lamp kept its small, patient circle. The receiver did not falter, the recorder continued with its patient redact, content on its own path. He returned to the chair, put the headphones on properly this time, both ears covered, the world becoming again a single useful room. Marigold, he said, the transmitter keyed with the light touch of habit, confirm hull status. Are you listening? Over. Another voice might have asked for coordinates again. Thomas did not. He had learned that people give you the thing they can before they attempt the thing they cannot. He asked for a shape of the problem, not its perfect address. Port list increasing, came the answer, composed, as if the speaker had placed his fear on the shelf with the mugs and chosen instead the cup-marked procedure. Bilge pump, a pause exactly long enough to check the word against the work. Not holding. Thomas let out a breath so slowly it had no shape. He wrote as he transcribed, port list increasing. Bilge pump compromised. He added, almost as an aside to himself, tone constant. Clarity improved under reduced room noise. He did not try to explain that last. Explanation is a poor sailor in certain seas. Marigold, he said, state weather at your position. Over. A more ordinary answer might have made him smile. Clear, the voice said. Starlight. The word carried a distance no map measures. He looked at the window as if to confirm what he already knew. Fog pressed so near you could have leaned your forehead against it and left no mark. Within the band, starlight, within the shack, the kind of soft dark a lamp loves, copy, he said. He did not argue meteorology with a ghost, though he did not use that word. Men at radios avoid words they do not need. He pressed the pencil's tip against the paper and did a small thing he had found useful in other odd nights. He wrote questions he had not yet asked and drew boxes beside them. Names. Last known coordinates. Call sign. Cargo. 3 souls, he ticked with a neat check. He paused, hand above the page, and let his mind make a map of what he could do without disturbing the strange accord that had formed. He could query regional logs for reports of a Marigold with 3 crew, lost or retired. He could ask Halifax if the name stirred any old file. He could call up a weather archive if he wished to match some imagined starlit night to a date. He did none of those yet. The night had given him its own instruction. The quieter you make yourself, the more the voice chooses words over repetitions. He obeyed the night the way he would obey calm water after a storm, by not rushing. Marigold, he said, say again your last known safe harbor. Over. A faint shift in the tone behind the voice, a near musical partial, as if another room had moved closer to his. Lunenburg, it said. The syllables had the softness of a man who loved the name of his home port. Then, as carefully as if signing a letter, the voice added a call sign, letters and numbers that fit the mouth of another decade. Thomas repeated the sequence aloud, the way one does to teach memory its duties. He wrote it down with the attention a man gives to a key. When he finished, he made a small box beside it and did not yet check it. Verification is a ceremony, not a conviction. Battery test at 7 minutes. He logged it. The room stayed generous with its quiet. Never actually silent, there is no such thing at sea or in its little land rooms, but measured, agreeable. He fancied, not fancifully, that the fog itself had leaned in to listen with him. He cued the recorder back and listened to the last exchange. The tape gave the words back without pride: 3 souls, port list, Lunenburg. The secondary tone sat there in the track like a thread the ear could follow with one finger. He wondered, gently, without the need to decide, if the tone matched the old mechanical heartbeat of a Fresnel lens turning on a clockwork that was now asleep upstairs. Impossible, but the mind likes to be tidy. He let the thought go the way one lets the ocean keep a coin. Marigold, he said at last, keeping his voice so even it might have been a soft hand on a shoulder, are you able to move under auxiliary power? Over. A pause. Not quite hesitation, consideration. Negative, the voice said. Waiting on the light. He could have asked which light. He did not. He looked at the covered lens upstairs, at the hush inside the glass. He put the tip of the pencil on the paper and left it there, making no mark. 22:55, under battery. Clarity increased. Responses coherent, procedural. Waiting on the light. He underlined the last phrase very lightly, not for drama but to keep it from slipping in the mind's pocket among the other small, round thoughts. 10 minutes elapsed. He returned the shack to mains, the transfer smooth, the generators hum coming back not as an intrusion but as the sound of a good animal returning to its stall. He listened for any change in the band. There was some, almost imperceptible. Clarity softened by a hair. He nodded, content with the thing confirmed. He left the overhead off. He left the fridge sleeping. He kept the heater low and his hands around the remains of warmth in the thermos lid. He had made a shape of quiet the voice seemed to prefer. Hospitality is a practice. Marigold, he said, what is your master's name? Over. A man's name came back, first and last, not common enough to be a coincidence, not flamboyant enough to be invented for drama. Thomas wrote it, said it once under his breath as if greeting someone stepping into a room. He made a small box beside it. He did not tick it yet. He thought of calling Halifax to ask if they had a file on that name, that vessel, that call sign. He thought of giving the night the courtesy of one more question asked within its rules before he knocked on the doors of other rooms. Marigold, he said, say your date. Over. Static moved across the frequency like a cat crossing a doorway without comment. Then, June 12. A year followed that had the weight of iron, set gently on the desk between them. Thomas did not react in the theatrical ways men imagine when they think of ghosts. He wrote the number as he would have written any other. He drew a little square and, without flourish, left it empty. The foghorn spoke its once-an-hour memory far out where the cliff met weather. In the shack, a drop finally decided to travel and made its dignified way down the pane. The receiver breathed. The recorder watched. Thomas sat. His pulse stayed in the place it belonged. Copy, he said. Marigold, keep this channel open. He did not add, if you can. The sea knows the ifs already that he closed the log for a moment, not to hide it from the air but to tell his hands to rest. He looked at nothing in particular. He let the quiet keep doing its good work. When he opened the book again, he turned a fresh page, drew his careful line at the top, and wrote, in the same tidy letters he had used his whole life, 2303, continuing silence tests at intervals. Priority to maintaining clarity. Preparing external verification of call sign and date. Station calm. Operator calm. He set the pen down, squared the recorder in its small place, and, as any good host would, waited to see what his guest chose to say next. The knight had the temperament of a librarian, watchful, courteous, exacting about noise. Thomas matched it. He kept the overhead dark, the heater gentle, the refrigerator sleeping. The shack felt the way a good chapel feels after the congregation has gone, ere holding the shape of attention that he wrote a small reminder to himself on a fresh line, silence is a tool, and underlined it as lightly as fog underlines the cliff. It wasn't doctrine. It was a habit of mind that had rescued men from believing storms were louder than they were. Marigold, he said, voice as even as a level held to wood, confirm nature of cargo. Over. A pause. It had the length of a man turning to look at labels he already knows by weight. Bait. Ice. Fuel enough to make the grounds and home. He wrote the words as if copying a recipe, not because the contents mattered to him now, but because particulars anchor the mind. He drew a box and left it open. The pencil's point made the smallest sound, a dry syllable against paper, and the recorder's read. I took it all down without commentary. He stood and crossed to the stair. The lantern room waited above with its patient glass. He climbed without hurry, hand finding each rail the way it has always found rails since the body learned ladders in its youth. The air up there was a degree cooler, the fog so present against the panes that it seemed a polite guest, refusing to crowd. The Fresnel lens sat under its brown canvas cover like a good instrument asleep in its case. He did not want drama. He wanted honesty. He lifted the cover back in neat folds and laid it along the sill, careful not to crease what age had already made fragile. The lens's prisms caught the lamplight from below and turned it into a quiet geometry. The station's main lamp had been long since retired from nightly duties. But the service light, small, dependable, a modest bulb on a modest mount, was meant for maintenance checks and kindnesses. He turned it on. It made a glow with the humility of a candle in a church, enough to give the lens something to consider. He did not attempt to spin the carriage. The old clockwork lay still, a good heart at rest. But even without motion, the lens held the small light in its facets and made of it an intention. He stood a moment with the glass and thought of the phrase the voice had offered, waiting on the light. Here it was, then, not the grand sweep that used to stitch sky and sea to safety, but a simple presence, not arguing with fog, merely being within it. He returned downstairs as he had come up, step by step, the sound of his boots respectful on the treads. In the shack, he wrote, 2312, service lamp engaged. Lens uncovered. Ambient noise minimized. Monitoring for changes. He listened. The band had the feel of a room whose door has been opened to someone expected. Static arranged itself, not dramatically, but with a greater willingness to admit shape. He placed the headphones properly, both ears covered, as if he were attending a recital given by someone with a quiet instrument. Marigold, he said, what is your heading by intention? Over. Home, the voice said. The word carried the exact weight of 3 letters and a harbor. Bearing set by the light. He did not tell the night that the light no longer swung its long arm across the horizon. He had given it a token. Sometimes tokens are how we remember what promises look like. Copy, he said. He drew a small circle around light in his notes, not an emphasis, a wreath, the secondary tone had changed. It sat closer to the voice now, less like a companion instrument, more like the fundamental to which the words attached themselves. Thomas turned the heater one more notch down until its fan stopped entirely. He cued the recorder back a breath and let it catch up. "Marigold," he said, "describe your sky." "Over." "Clear," the voice said again, but this time there was a softness that made the word less meteorology and more memory. "Stars, bright enough to count." He wrote it, not because the shack needed to be convinced of weather beyond its fog, but because writing the skies of other places has always done men good. "Marigold," he said, "you reported taking water. Describe rate." "Over." "Steady," came the reply. Still no panic, no stiffening anger at fate. Just a man in the narrow corridor called now doing what he had trained to do when fear would have liked to occupy all the chairs. Thomas drew a line down the margin and made a list of the checkboxes he had left blank: coordinates, call sign verification, date, master's name verification. He had a path for each: the index, the archive, a call to Halifax in the small hour. But the night's rule held. Ask for the thing the voice can give. Allow its givenness to bend the room toward truth. "Marigold," he said, "do you have flares aboard?" "Over." "Affirmative," the voice said. "Holding until the light." Another glance upward, as automatic as breath. He pictured the small service lamp inhabiting the lens like a candle in a cathedral, insufficient by physics to travel a mile, but perfectly suited to the particular travel of intention that he wrote, holding until the light. He underlined it once, the way one might underscore a line in a letter you'll fold and keep. He realized, not with surprise but with a calm that felt earned, that he was not going to ask for coordinates again. A man with a map had placed his finger on home and said he would steer by what he trusted. Thomas had already done the other part. He had put a light where a light was supposed to be. He took the headphones off briefly and let the room's small sounds return. The shacks would inhaled and exhaled with the tide of temperature. The foghorn out beyond spoke its long note to no one in particular. He poured a last inch of coffee, now only friendly warm, and held it until his hands remembered the thermos was empty. He set it aside, wrote "thermos" out in the margin without thinking, a small domestic note among the C's. He keyed the transmitter again. "Marigold," he said, "maintain channel, maintain calm. Light is established. I will remain." Over. There was no doctrine in the last sentence. It was the sort of promise men make to each other across tables and band widths because they have found that promises spoken aloud change the shape of a night. Standing by, the voice said that he watched the line of the receiver's meter fall and rise with no tide but the one radio's no. He imagined, not fancifully, but as a mechanic imagines the inside of an engine, the three on board, the master with his hand steady on a wheel he could not trust, a deckhand at a pump, a third watching the horizon that was not a line but a name. He made a note that was not for verification and not for record keeping. It was for the human part of an official log, good discipline in voice. Composed. Feels like company. He did not apologize to the page for the sentiment. Minutes slid by without incident. That is a thing to be grateful for in any rescue, even one conducted across decades and frequencies. He listened for the tone behind the tone and found it still there, thinner now, as if the second room had stepped back half a pace but was still within the conversation's reach. "Marigold," he said, "state your crew by roll." Over. "Master," the voice said, giving the name again, the one that fit the mouth of another year. "Mate." "Deckhand." 3 souls enumerated as if in a prayer. He wrote them. He did not fill the boxes for verification. That would be work for the hour when the world wakes and files put on their spectacles. The night had a different task, and he had accepted it. He looked at the lantern room once more and, on a thought that felt like common sense dressed as kindness, he rose and climbed again. The lens held the service lamp's modest glow like a story cupped in both hands. He took his flashlight, dimmed to its lowest setting, and, shielding it with his palm, gave the lens a slow, gentle passing of light, not to cast far but to let the glass remember how to gather and release. Downstairs, the band did something so small most men would have missed it. The static thinned as if a fine curtain had been drawn aside. The voice, when it returned, arrived without the secondary tone, light in sight. It said that he sat without sitting quickly. He did not answer at once. Some sentences prefer not to be touched. When he did speak, his voice came the way quiet surface water looks. Copy, Marigold. You are not alone. Over. Silence followed. Not rude, not empty. A rest between measures. He wrote, 2328, light in sight. Secondary tone absent. Voice steady. Conditions unchanged within shack. He laid the pencil down with care, as if to keep its little point from waking. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to let the room expand. A few minutes later, the voice returned, softer than before, the crispness of procedure shading into gratitude so thin you had to be very still to hear it. Standing by on 16, it said, and then, after a breath, thank you. He did not say you're welcome. He logged the words, the time. He let the thank you rest where it had perched. The night went on doing what nights do when people agree to share them. It became itself very gradually. Somewhere beyond the fog, waves combed the same stretch of rock they had combed since the first lens was hauled up these stairs. In the shack, the recorder turned its tape with patient industry, keeping account without judgment. Thomas kept his watch at a T2341, he wrote, maintaining light. Maintaining channel. Preparing external verification for dawn. He drew his careful line, squared the log on the desk as if it were a picture in need of plumb, and folded his hands again. If the sea had a face, he thought, not fancifully, simply as a man who had looked at it all his life, it would look like this room at night, full of small sounds that mean nothing and everything, full of instruments that are not instruments unless someone listens. Still here, he said, without keying the transmitter. The words belonged to the shack and to the man in it. The night kept them. Midnight arrived without ceremony, as if the hour had taken off its shoes in the hallway and let itself in. Thomas logged it, midnight, station steady. Light maintained. Channel open. And rested the pencil on the spine so the page would hold its place like a living thing. Marigold, he said, voice low and even, report list. Over. Easing, the answer came. Not triumphant, not relieved, simply factual with a softness at its edges. Holding by the light. He wrote that, too. It had become a small prayer in the log's steady hand. The service lamp kept its careful duty above, captured and multiplied by the lens into a presence larger than its bulb deserved. Thomas thought of how much of life is this, modest means used exactly, making of themselves more than they are because intention asks it. He listened to the band and let the shack find a deeper stillness. He had promised external verification for dawn, but there were checks he could perform without breaking the night's delicate accord. He keyed the transmitter to a secondary channel, voice pitched for courtesy. Halifax Watch, North Point Auxiliary. Routine archival inquiry pending dawn, non-urgent. Request cross-check of call sign. He gave the sequence slowly, clearly, as one gives a name you wish to keep intact. Possible historical listing. Reply at convenience. Over. A long second, then a voice with the tolerant warmth of someone grateful the world had not chosen crisis for the moment. North Point, Halifax Watch. Copy your inquiry. We'll pull what we can from the old register. Will advise. Over. Much appreciated, Thomas said. He signed, returned to 16, and wrote in the margin, Halifax query sent, non-urgent. Maintain quiet. The words were a kind of promise to the room as much as to any file. A small drift of chill moved through the shack. He welcomed it, the cool made attention clean. He cupped his hands and let them warm at the ghost of the thermos. Above, the lantern room settled with a tiny tick, glass adjusting to the night's decision. Marigold, he said, confirm bilge status. Over. Improved, the voice replied, and then, with the smallest hesitation that felt like a man choosing honesty over optimism, for now. Copy, Thomas said. A pencil line touched the page and lifted again. He did not ask for the coordinates he knew would not come. He asked instead for the detail the mind can hold when the world tilts. Describe what you see forward. Over. Light, said the voice after a breath that had the shape of turning one's head toward a window. Steady. Not sweeping, but enough. The last word seemed to warm in his mouth as if the syllables were a cup between two hands. Thomas looked up the stairs as if the service lamp could hear praise. He wrote the sentence carefully so it would keep its posture on the page when read again by daylight. Minutes passed in their neat clothing. The recorder rolled. The foghorn, far out, offered its long vowel to whatever ships had the dignity to need it. Thomas's gaze softened the way a night watchman's does when he has measured a room and found it willing. He listened not for incident but for continuance. AT-013, the receiver gave a modest tap of strength, the kind of little swell that means someone, somewhere, has moved half a degree closer to the possibility of being heard. Halifax watched to North Point, the other channel said, almost apologetically for intruding on a quiet hour. Preliminary from archives. Call sign you provided matches trawler Marigold, Registry Lunenburg. Status recorded as lost at sea, June 12, 1973. A pause carried the weight of rooms with old boxes. Casualty list indicates 3 souls. No formal coordinates at final contact. Copy. Thomas let the words arrive and place themselves where they belonged. He did not invite them farther into the room than they needed to come. He wrote without tightening his hand, Halifax preliminary, call sign verified, historical loss recorded, 3 souls. 1973, then he drew a line under the entry that looked like respect. Copy, he said on the secondary channel. Thank you, Halifax. No further at this time. Good watch. He signed and returned to 16, letting the band become again the one conversation he had promised himself to keep. He did not look around for drama. The shack had none to offer and did not owe him any. He looked at the open log, the pencil, the recorder's little ember of light, and felt the sensation that had visited him on perhaps half a dozen nights in his long career, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he knew how to do, for reasons the world might not explain later. Marigold, he said, North Point here. Light remains. Channel remains. Over. There was a pause with the texture of breath on a window. Then, steady, the voice replied, as if returning his word to him, the secondary tone, once a companion, later a scaffold, did not return. The voice wrote alone now, its consonants precisely what a hand might write on a form, its vowels with the smallest human warmth of someone who has learned how to keep fear introduced but not seated. Marigold, Thomas said after another interval in which the rain nearly forgot itself, confirmed crew condition. Over. Cold, the voice answered, and the word was almost friendly. Working. He underlined working because a man's life often consists of that and the names he gives it. He let the line sit light as the fog on the pane. The hour gathered itself. He looked at the battery test times, the margins of the page, the spare cassette. He flipped the tape no earlier than it needed and logged it. Old habits are a kind of mercy because they keep hands busy without asking the heart to invent. The recorder resumed, the red-eye content, marigold, he said, report horizon. Over. Light broadening, came the answer. See, quieter. A man could be forgiven for hearing gratitude in the second word. Thomas did not need forgiveness. He heard it and wrote it and left it unadorned. That he climbed once more to the lantern room, not for effect, but to look upon the thing he had asked to bear meaning. The lens nodded light into the fog like an elder telling a story everyone already knows but needs to hear again. He placed his palm, very briefly, near the service lamp, not touching, simply near, until the little heat there convinced him that presence, even modest presence, travels. When he returned to the console, he found his chair exactly as he had left it. The pencil had not rolled. The page had not turned itself. He sat, and the room settled one small fraction closer to complete. Marigold, he said, stayed in tension. Hold for the light, the voice said, then home. He did not answer immediately. The sentence had come a very long way to arrive in his small room. He let it sit, warm itself, and then wrote it down with the neatness of a clerk who respects the dignity of another man's words. Outside, the fog lifted and lowered its veil by measures too subtle for the eye to see and too real for the sea to ignore. The rain had become mostly memory. The wind laid its hand on the shack and did not push. Marigold, he said, I will maintain watch until relief. Light will remain. You are heard. Over. Understood, the voice replied, and then, after a pause so slight it could have been the width of a breath, standing by with thanks. The words placed themselves in the log the way a coat is hung on a peg you've used all your life. He wrote the time. He drew his line. He placed the pencil parallel to the page edge. He allowed himself one long breath that began at the ribs and ended in the shoulders, the kind of breath a man might take when a boat touches a dock and the rope is over the post. At 052, Halifax returned one last time, courteous to the hour. North Point, Halifax watch. Secondary confirmation, Marigold listed with master's name as provided. Last traffic recorded on June 12, 1973. Phrase recorded in the old log, light in sight. That's all we have. Good night, North Point. Over. Thomas smiled, the sort of small, private smile a man offers a story that agrees with itself. Copy, he said. Good night, Halifax. He made the note. He did not write sentiment. The room already held it. That he looked at the lamp upstairs and thought, not as a poet but as an operator, that sometimes the job is to keep a simple thing going until the part of the world that needs it can find its own way by it. He stayed very still. The receiver breathed. The tape turned. The fog leaned in and then away as if remembering an old dance. Marigold, he said once more, North Point with you. A soft carrier came up, like a hand raised in a crowd so you know a friend is there. No words followed it. Words weren't always the point. Thomas opened a fresh page and wrote his heading with the calm flourish of habit. Final night log, 0100 to 0400. Beneath it, he set out the bones of what he would keep. Light maintained, channel maintained, responses calm, verification pending, file copy, operator present. He did not yet fill the hours. He would live them, then let the pen catch up. That he settled his shoulders, fitted the headphones as a craftsman fits his tools to his hands, and gave the night the kind of attention that has saved lives without ever needing to be seen to do it. If the sea wished to speak again, he was ready. If it wished to rest on the word enough, he was ready for that, too. Outside, invisible and faithful, the lens continued to hold a candle to the fog. Inside, a man kept his promise the way light keeps its shape, by being there. The hours between 1 and 4 walked softly. Thomas kept the channel open, the service light steady, the shack trimmed to quiet. The receiver breathed its mild weather. When he spoke, he did so as one calls down a hallway in a familiar house, low, certain, never in a hurry. Marigold, North Point with you. A carrier rose at intervals like a nod through a window. No new words were needed. He logged the acknowledgments as small ticks of presence, 0132, 0204, 0239, carrier only, voice presumed steady. The pencil made its neat footprints and lifted again. Once, near 3, the voice returned with a sentence that seemed to have waited until the room could hold it. Cease settling. He wrote it exactly, because nights like this deserve to be told cleanly in daylight. Beyond the glass, the fog loosened by a degree so small it would not have been a change to anyone but a person who had spent years learning the shapes of weather. The sound of rain faded to the memory of rain. The wall of air outside became a veil again. The foghorn rested its long story and did not resume. That he rose at 0320 to look once more at the lamp upstairs. The lens still held its modest candle as if it had been entrusted with a child's sleep. He set the cover within reach but did not draw it over. He stood in that quiet ring of glass and watched the fog thin over the invisible cliff, then returned to his chair. Marigold, he said, state intention. Home, came the reply, so soft and sure it felt like a hand closing a latch. Then nothing more. He didn't pursue it. He made the entry, 0328, home. He drew a line beneath the word and left the rest of the line blank, not out of sentiment, but because blank space can be a kind of witness. At 0347, Halifax came up on the secondary channel once more, respectful of the hour. North Point, Halifax watch. Archival note appended. Old log shows last recorded phrase as light in sight. Your earlier report matches. No further details. Good watch. Copy, Thomas said, and meant thank you without saying it. He signed off, returned to 16, and let the room reclaim its soft gravity. The tape reached its end with the quiet, rounded click only old recorders make. He turned it over, pressed the red button until it glowed again, and wrote 0351, side B. The recorder resumed its patient work as if it had never been interrupted. The first pale line of morning arrived as a difference in the window, not in color but in depth. The fog took on a body you could almost see. The panes looked less like mirrors and more like skin. The shacks would give a tiny sound, as houses do when they recognize morning. Thomas wrote the time and the word dawn out of courtesy. Marigold, he said, and paused, listening to the way his own voice inhabited the nearly morning. North Point remaining until relief. Light remains. He did not add anything he didn't need to. People who mean to keep a promise keep it simple. The carrier rose once more, steadier now, then thinned and did not return. He did not call after it. He set his hand on the log, felt the warmth the book had gathered from the desk lamp. At 0410, he climbed to the lantern room and, with the same neat care he had used to uncover the lens, folded the cover back over it. The service lamp he switched off with a small turn, the way one dims a bedside light so as not to wake a sleeping house. The glass accepted its own reflection again. He paused, not in doubt, just because stillness is a way of saying thank you. Downstairs, he brought the shack back to its daylight posture. He plugged in the refrigerator, nudged the heater to a working temper, left the overhead off. Morning would be bright enough. He uncapped the pencil and wrote across a fresh line, 0418, service lamp secured. Channel remains open. No further voice traffic. He underlined remains lightly, because a thing can be both finished and present. The first bird came thinly through the fog, a single note that sounded like a test rather than a song. The cliff took the sound and gave it back smaller. Thomas poured the last shadow of coffee into the lid, tasted the metallic coolness, and let the cup sit as if to mark the hour. He turned the recorder off and labeled the cassette with his square, patient hand, Lighthouse Log, Night Watch, 1973/Marigold, 2200-0418. He slid it into its paper sleeve and set it atop the console as one sets a letter to be posted. That he heard the truck before he saw it, tires on gravel, a door opening with that small stiffness metal keeps on a wet morning. Boots approached the shack with a measured tread. This would be relief, day watch, paperwork and checks, daylight voices. He straightened the logbook on the desk, squared the recorder next to it, and felt the familiar quiet that comes when a duty is ready to be handed over. The door opened. Damp air reintroduced the outside. The person on the threshold, hood up, shoulders dotted with beads of fog, stood a moment in that courtesy which is not speaking in a room that is clearly listening. A nod. Thomas returned it. Morning, the relief said, voice low to match the place. No more was needed. The word carried a whole language. I'm here. You can rest now. Morning, Thomas said. He turned the logbook toward the doorway and slid it forward. All yours. The relief stepped in, closed the door softly, and moved to the desk. Hands, steady, careful, landed on the book's edges. Thomas watched the eyes travel the lines with the kind of attention he respected. There's more than one kind of seamanship. Anything to flag? The relief asked after a moment, still reading. Verification from Halifax in the night, Thomas said. Old traffic matched a call from a trawler out of Lunenburg. Free on board. Phrase recorded then, recorded again tonight. Light in sight. He kept his tone even, factual. The night could keep its own wonder. The relief glanced toward the stairs, then back to the page. You lit the service. For quiet company, Thomas said. Not for distance. A small smile, professional, understanding, not approval exactly, not disbelief. The kind of expression that says I would have done it, too, without having to. The relief read a little longer. The room accepted new breathing. When the page turned, the paper made that mild sound of two surfaces separating kindly. Thomas stood to the side as one stands aside at a hatch. Present, unintrusive. You've kept a good watch, the relief said, the words as plain as a signed form. Thomas nodded. The compliment didn't land as praise so much as a statement of weather. He accepted it in the way one accepts the fact of dawn. The relief's finger paused at a line. Here, they said, very softly, not calling attention so much as sharing an object found on a beach. Half tucked beneath the logbook's last page lay an older sheet, thin paper, edges browned, bearing a handwriting not his. It had been folded once, then kept flat so long the fold had softened into a suggestion. The top read, North Point, Night Log, 1973. Below, a single line written with the same tidy economy Thomas favored, light in sight. Standing by. Thank you. They both looked at it without speaking. The relief lifted the page with two fingers and set it gently above the current log, not as evidence, not as mystery, simply as a document that had chosen its time. Archives must have misfiled it, the relief said, tone neutral. Maybe, Thomas said, not from doubt, but from the careful posture of a man who knows that some explanations belong to other rooms. They let the paper rest where it was. The fog brightened without thinning, a common morning compromise. The bird tried another note, slightly braver. Anything else? The relief asked. Recorders labeled, Thomas said. Battery test logged. Halifax inquiry noted. No coordinates ever given. He paused, then added what felt like a footnote that belonged in the margin, even spoken, good discipline in the voice. The relief nodded and pulled the log a fraction closer, pen ready. "We'll carry it forward," they said, and the simple promise closed a circuit the night had drawn. Thomas stepped back from the console. His hands, momentarily without a task, found the old pouch and zipped it by habit. The little reluctance in the zipper gave its familiar resistance, then relented. He pocketed the thermos, light and clean, a thing finished for now that he looked once, only once, up the stair to where the lens now sat covered, a sleeping instrument, a faithful witness at rest. He did not feel compelled to say goodbye to it. He had learned to leave good tools without ceremony. "Good watch," he said to the relief, "good rest," came back, easy as a tide that he opened the door. Morning pressed its damp, cool palm against his face in greeting. The fog had lifted enough to show the first suggestion of horizon, not a line yet, but the idea of one. The sea below worked its steady work, combing rock with patience born of not needing to finish anything today that he stepped out, boots meeting the small stones of the path with the authority of someone who knows where to put his feet. He closed the door carefully, not because anyone was sleeping, but because good rooms deserve courtesy. The truck waited as trucks do, without ambition, ready for the next small duty. Before he got in, he stood with his hands on the cab and let the air do what it does to a man who has been inside a long time. He listened, not for radios now, not for voices, but for the simple sound of the world resuming the day. There it was, water where it should be, fog where it had chosen to be, the long patience of coasts that he thought briefly, and without trying to keep the thought, of a boat somewhere in a sky full of counted stars, turning its bow a finger's width to starboard because a modest light inside a covered lens had asked it to. He did not need to know anything else that he got in the truck and started the engine. The sound felt like a friend clearing his throat to speak in a warm room. He eased onto the gravel, then the narrow road, then away along the coast he knew as well as the backs of his hands. Behind him, the shack settled to its day work. The relief's pen touched paper. The old page lay above the new one without competing, the way two waves share a shore. The recorder's cassette, labeled and square, waited for a shelf. Upstairs, the lens rested in its canvas like an instrument waiting for the next concert it might never play. That on the seat beside him, the logbook's last sentence from his watch, neat, unadorned, lived again in his mind, the way a tune lives without being hummed, light maintained. Channel maintained. You are heard. The road turned, then another bend. The fog, behind him now, kept the lighthouse for itself a while longer. The morning did what mornings do. And somewhere, whether in a past that had found a route through static or in a present that knew how to listen, a small boat made for home. Welcome back to Night Whispers, where horror drifts quietly between dreams and nightmares. Tonight's story is The Lighthouse of Lost Souls, a tale of isolation, whispers in the fog, and a light that remembers more than it should. So settle in. Breathe deeply. And listen closely. The letter arrived that morning, slipped under my door like a whisper from another world. No signature. No return address. Only a single line, smeared slightly by drizzle, come before midnight. The light remembers those who linger. I stared at it for a long while. My first thought was that it must be a prank. Yet something in the words pulled at me, an invisible current dragging me forward. By evening, I was driving along the coastal road, the sky heavy with clouds, wind whipping across the cliffs. The lighthouse appeared before the road did, rising through thick, rolling fog like a sentinel from another era. Its paint was weathered and gray, its foundation darkened with moss and salt. The beacon at the top stood still, broken, or waiting. I parked at the cliff's edge, gravel crunching under my tires, and approached on foot. The wind tugged at my coat, howling as if urging me to turn back. Yet each step closer felt like crossing a threshold into another world. Fog swallowed me whole as I reached the first steps leading up to the lighthouse door. The stone was slick and ancient, worn by countless storms. Shadows shifted in ways they shouldn't, and I caught glimpses of figures at the edge of vision. Gone the moment I turned my head, the heavy door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside smelled of damp wood and rust. Dust lay thick across the floorboards, broken only by faint footprints I couldn't explain. Somewhere above, a spiral staircase twisted upward like a spine of memory, waiting to be climbed, and with each step, the lighthouse seemed to breathe, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The spiral staircase behind me groaned softly as I descended into the middle levels of the lighthouse. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself weighed down my body. The dim light from my lantern barely penetrated the shadows, revealing glimpses of old furniture and scattered debris. Broken chairs leaned awkwardly, rusted hinges hanging from doors, and dust thick enough to catch in my eyelashes that in the corner of a small hallway, I noticed a partially open door leading into a tiny study. The room smelled of damp paper and mildew, a scent that settled deep into my chest. On the desk lay a thick logbook, larger than the ones I had seen upstairs, with a cover worn smooth from decades of hands turning its pages. The air felt almost alive around it, dense with anticipation, as though the lighthouse itself waited to share its secrets. That I opened the logbook carefully. The first page was neatly written in ink that had faded to brown, detailing the daily routines of Edwin Harrow, the keeper whose photograph I had glimpsed yesterday. The entries began innocuously, describing the maintenance of the light, repairs on the stone steps, and inspections of the foghorn. Yet, as I turned the pages, the writing shifted. The ink became blotchy, the lines uneven, almost frantic. The fog today is heavier than usual. Shapes move beyond the light's reach. They do not speak, but I feel their intent. The lighthouse remembers. It whispers. I hear it calling my name. A shiver crawled up my spine. I closed my eyes briefly, listening. Only the rain, the wind, and the distant ocean answered. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention. Something had been here, watching that. As I read further, I discovered entries detailing strange events that defied logic. Shadows that lingered too long, reflections in the broken windows that did not match reality, voices echoing in empty rooms. One line made my blood run cold. I no longer know if the shadows are mine, or if I belong to them. I set the logbook down momentarily and surveyed the room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with papers, old maps of the coastline, and photographs of storm-tossed ships. One photograph caught my eye, a shipwreck I didn't recognize, partially submerged beneath a gray sky, waves crashing against jagged rocks. On closer inspection, faint figures seemed to move along the deck, impossible in a still image. A sudden creak behind me made me whirl around. Nothing. Only the shadows stretching across the corners of the room. I laughed softly to myself, though the sound felt hollow. Still, the sense of being observed was undeniable. Returning to the logbook, I noticed that later entries became almost unreadable. Ink smears obscured entire lines, yet I could make out fragments. The fog grows impatient, the reflections stare too long, voices promise safety but lie. I cannot leave The rhythm of the writing suggested panic, urgency. I ran my finger along a particularly dark line and realized the ink was slightly wet. My heart leapt. Was it condensation from the lighthouse, or had someone touched this recently? I forced myself to take a deep breath. This was a story, a record of a man lost in isolation, nothing more, but then a faint whisper, carried by the draft of the broken windows, tickled my ear. Do not linger, do not linger, do not linger. I froze. The sound was barely audible, yet it penetrated deeper than the wind or rain. It seemed to originate from the logbook itself. My instincts screamed to leave, yet my curiosity chained me to the room. One more page. I needed to know the conclusion, the fate of Edwin Harrow. My eyes scanned quickly, almost desperate to escape the tension building in my chest. They are patient. They wait for those who linger too long. I have seen faces in the glass that are not mine. My reflection follows me when I am elsewhere. I write these words knowing the fog watches. The light remembers, and soon, so will I. A distant crash of waves punctuated the entry. My lantern flickered, casting the room in erratic shadows that stretched across the walls. Something moved in the corner of my eye, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. That I stood abruptly, knocking the logbook to the floor. It landed with a thud that echoed unnaturally, reverberating as though the lighthouse amplified the sound. I caught a glimpse of my own shadow, or was it something else, sliding along the walls, stretching too long, moving in ways my body could not replicate. The air grew heavier, charged, like static before a storm. The fog outside the windows thickened, curling into the room as if trying to enter. I took a step backward, tripping over a chair. Pain shot through my ankle, but I ignored it. My attention was drawn to a small mirror leaning against the far wall that I had not seen it before. The glass was warped and old, but in its reflection, the room seemed wrong. Shadows that should have been stationary wavered, figures appeared behind me that weren't there when I turned, and the rain outside distorted into a gray veil that seemed almost alive. That I approached the mirror cautiously. The reflection shifted as I moved, lagging behind my motions by a fraction of a second. I raised my hand, and the hand in the mirror paused, hesitated, then followed. A soft, breathy whisper floated through the room. You came, now you remain. My heart thundered. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern, and it cast a spinning circle of light across the floor. The shadows outside the mirror's frame seemed to reach toward me, stretching impossibly. My body screamed to run, yet my mind was trapped, reading, observing, understanding the depth of the lighthouse's power over those who lingered. The logbook lay at my feet. I reached down, flipping through the remaining pages. There were sketches, maps of hidden staircases and rooms, annotations marking areas where the fog was thickest. Notes suggested methods of escape, or perhaps traps for the unwary. One margin note, written hastily, caught my eye: the beacon will guide you, but not to safety. Follow it at your own peril. A sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing my lantern for an instant. Darkness swallowed me. When the light returned, the fog outside had thickened to the point I could no longer see the cliffs or the waves below. The lighthouse was no longer just a building, it was a living entity, patient, ancient, and aware of my presence. That I could hear it now: faint creaks, whispers, the soft tapping of footsteps on the stairs above, though the lighthouse was supposed to be empty. I realized then that the logbook was not just a record, it was a warning, a guide, and a lure that I stepped backward, tripping over another chair, and a soft laugh, almost human but impossibly distant, drifted from somewhere within the walls. My pulse raced, but the fog seemed to settle, watching patiently, like a predator studying its prey. The lighthouse remembered everything, every visitor, every whispered secret. And now, so would I, whether I wished it or not. The lighthouse seemed alive now, its silence heavy with expectation. I stepped carefully over the uneven floorboards, my lantern's dim glow revealing walls warped with age and shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the storm outside. Every creak of the spiral staircase felt deliberate, echoing like a warning through the stone corridors that I knew the fog had thickened outside. I could barely see the cliffs, the ocean, or the edge of the lighthouse grounds. Yet something urged me forward, deeper into the structure, toward the beacon I had glimpsed in my first ascent. My instincts screamed to flee, yet curiosity tethered me like a chain, invisible but unyielding. Ascending the spiral staircase again, I noticed the walls now bore marks I hadn't seen before, faint scratches in the wood, some forming crude symbols, others jagged and frantic, as though clawed by hands desperate to escape. I reached out, tracing one with a finger. It felt cold, almost alive. A whisper tickled my ear, "The fog sees you, the fog waits." I spun, lantern raised, but the hallway was empty. Only the shadows danced, flickering unnaturally. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I moved faster, though cautiously, as if the lighthouse itself might punish a misstep. Halfway to the top, a faint light shimmered through the fogged windows. It wasn't the beacon yet, it was smaller, warmer, flickering like a candle. I approached and found a tiny alcove where a single lantern hummed, swaying slightly, though no wind reached this interior corner. Its glow revealed something remarkable: footprints, fresh and wet, leading from the staircase into the wall. They stopped abruptly that I knelt, examining them. The impressions were small, uneven, and impossible to place. They didn't match my own, nor any human stride I knew. The lantern flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. In the mirror across the hall, I saw movement, just at the edge of vision, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless. When I blinked, it vanished. A soft scratching began from above, echoing down the stairwell. My pulse quickened. The lighthouse was not empty. Whoever, or whatever, had been here before was still present, watching, waiting. I climbed the final stretch of stairs, every step a measured risk. My lungs burned, legs quivering, yet I could not stop. At the top, the beacon chamber sprawled open, glass cracked and fog curling inside. The room smelled of salt, wet stone, and a faint metallic tang. Shadows clung to every corner, stretching unnaturally. I raised my lantern higher. The light bounced across the room, revealing the massive mechanism of the beacon, rusted and silent. A sudden movement outside the cracked glass caught my eye. I approached cautiously. Through the fog, shapes drifted, thin, elongated, moving as if weightless. They glided closer, halting just beyond the window. My reflection in the cracked glass shifted slightly, lagging behind my movements. A whisper, "You cannot leave, you follow too far." The words made my blood run cold. I took a step back. My own shadow, elongated and distorted, seemed to stretch toward the shapes outside. A gust of wind rattled the broken glass, sending chills down my spine. The fog pressed closer, curling tendrils inside the chamber, brushing against my skin like icy fingers that I turned to inspect the beacon mechanism. The rusted gears were still, yet faint scratchings along the metal spoke of movement. Tiny etchings, perhaps from a previous keeper, marked warnings I could barely decipher in the lantern's flicker. The fog is patient. Those who linger will be remembered. I swallowed hard, the room feeling smaller, heavier, as though the lighthouse itself leaned in to observe. I scanned the chamber and noticed an old hatchway leading to a narrow passage, its entrance almost concealed behind the beacon's shadow. Hesitation clawed at me, but I knew instinctively this passage held the key to understanding, or perhaps escaping, the lighthouse's strange hold. The passage was tight, stone walls slick with moisture. Water dripped from above, echoing softly into the chamber below. My lantern cast eerie, long shadows, revealing scratches along the stone, symbols I did not recognize. With each step, the fog seemed to follow me, curling into the passage, whispering incoherently, "Do not linger, do not linger, do not linger." My pulse hammered in my chest. Shapes shifted within the fog, distant yet unnervingly close. The narrow corridor seemed endless, but faint light flickered ahead, like a candle fighting the darkness. I moved toward it, every nerve on edge, aware of something breathing just beyond my perception. Finally, the corridor opened into a small chamber. It appeared to be an observation room, once used to monitor the cliffs and the sea below. Broken instruments lay scattered, a brass telescope, rusted compasses, water-stained charts. Yet the strangest feature was the large mirror along one wall, its surface warped and uneven that I approached cautiously. In its reflection, I saw not only myself but the fog beyond the windows moving as though alive, shapes forming and dispersing, whispering unintelligibly. One figure stood out, tall, thin, unmoving. Yet when I blinked, it was gone. The mirror seemed to hold it, a prisoner of glass, waiting for me to notice. That a soft, breathy whisper, "The fog remembers, the fog always remembers." I staggered backward, nearly tripping over the debris. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against my chest. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the lighthouse, mixing with distant waves crashing into jagged cliffs. I realized then that the lighthouse itself was alive, not wood and stone, but something older, patient, aware of those who entered. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the beacon above. I looked up just in time to see a shadow dart across the broken glass, gone as quickly as it appeared. My lantern flickered violently, threatening to die, and I felt a pull in my chest, as if the fog itself were reaching inside, testing my resolve. That I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands. I had come too far to turn back now. The whispers, the shapes, the reflections, all pieces of a puzzle I had yet to solve. Somewhere in this fog, in this lighthouse, the answers awaited. And I had no choice but to follow them, deeper into the unknown. The small observation room felt alive. The mirror on the wall was no longer just glass, it was a portal of sorts, a surface that seemed to breathe and shift. I stood frozen, watching my reflection hesitate, lagging behind my movements by a fraction of a second. A shadowy figure lingered behind me in the glass, tall and impossibly thin, its presence undeniable, yet absent from reality. My breath caught. I reached out, hand trembling, and touched the cold surface. The mirror rippled like liquid, distorting my fingers, elongating them, stretching them into shapes that should not exist. The whisper came again, soft but deliberate. "Do you see, or do you dare to move?" A shiver ran through me, my skin prickling. I staggered backward, almost tripping over a rusted telescope. The shadow in the mirror moved closer, gliding across the glass without disturbing the room. My pulse raced. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I could not look away. The reflection was compelling, hypnotic, like the fog outside drawing me into its endless gray. The room itself seemed to contract, walls bending subtly, ceilings lowering. I realized then that the lighthouse was not merely a building, it was a vessel, alive, aware, responding to my fear and curiosity. I glanced around desperately for another exit, but the only doors led back into the fog-drenched corridor. A soft metallic scraping echoed from the corner. I turned slowly and saw a shadow flicker across the floor, small and irregular, like a child moving in slow motion. The mirror responded, elongating the figure, stretching it across the glass in impossible proportions. My mind screamed to run, yet my feet remained planted. I forced myself to breathe, trying to steady the lantern in my hand. Its light revealed fragments of the past, etched symbols along the walls, tiny scratches in the wood-forming letters, words barely legible. One phrase repeated itself, haunting in its simplicity: "The fog reflects, the fog remembers, the fog takes." The whispering grew louder, more coherent. Voices layered over one another, half a dozen, maybe more. Some echoed my own thoughts, repeating my fears, twisting them into unfamiliar rhythms. Shapes swirled in the mirror, faces I did not recognize, stretching and melting into one another. Each blink brought a new horror. I stumbled closer, almost compelled to speak to the reflection. My voice trembled. "Who are you? What do you want?" No response, only the slow, deliberate movement of shadows in the glass. The figure behind me grew clearer, a man, or something like a man, with hollow eyes that burned with intent. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear. The fog outside pressed against the windows, curling inside, reaching with unseen hands. A sudden realization struck me: the lighthouse was a trap for perception, a prison for those who looked too closely. The logbooks, the symbols, the corridors, they were all designed to draw attention, to test sanity, to lure curiosity into something older, more patient. I turned, desperate to escape, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire chamber. The lantern swung violently, casting fleeting light on the walls. Shadows danced, merging, twisting, forming faces that grinned with impossible intent. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The mirror shifted again. This time, my reflection moved independently. It raised a hand, pointing toward the hatch I had entered from. But then it smiled, my lips forming a grin I had never made. A whisper, this time unmistakable, echoed directly in my mind: "You are already part of it. You cannot leave unchanged." Panic surged. I stumbled backward, knocking over the rusted telescope. The mirror responded instantly, the figure lunging forward, its hand reaching out as if to touch me through the glass. My fingers brushed the surface, cold, liquid, alive. The fog outside hissed like a serpent, curling through the cracked windows into the room. I backed toward the wall, tripping over a broken chair. My lantern flickered and died, plunging the chamber into near darkness. The mirror glowed faintly, an unnatural light emanating from within. Shapes danced in the glow, figures I could neither name nor count. One step closer, and I felt the air thicken, pressing against my chest, constricting, as though the lighthouse were inhaling me. The whispers multiplied, voices overlapping, chanting in a rhythm both alien and familiar. The fog remembers, the fog reflects, the fog takes. Desperation drove me to the hatch. I yanked it open and scrambled through the narrow passage, the lantern's remnants slipping from my hand. Behind me, the mirror pulsed, a heartbeat of darkness, as if the lighthouse itself were alive and aware of my escape attempt. The shadows pressed closer, reaching, twisting, trying to pull me back. That I emerged into the corridor below, breath ragged, heart hammering. The fog was thicker than ever, curling into every corner, every crevice. The whispers followed, echoing from every direction, yet nowhere, fading and returning like waves crashing on jagged cliffs. I knew then that I had not escaped the lighthouse, only delayed its attention. The logbooks had warned me, the symbols had whispered, the reflections had revealed. The lighthouse was patient. It would wait for the curious, the restless, the seekers. And I had become one of them. That I pressed onward, deeper into the fog, the whispers fading behind me. But as I moved, I knew the reflection lingered, watching, waiting, marking me as a part of its memory. The lighthouse would remember me long after the fog settled again, long after the rain ceased, long after I had returned, or thought I had. The narrow corridor seemed endless, wet stone walls closing in as the fog pressed its cold fingers through every crack. My lungs burned with each breath, heart hammering like a drumbeat against my ribs. I had barely escaped the mirror chamber, yet the weight of the lighthouse's presence was inescapable. Each step forward felt guided, measured, as though the building itself had mapped my path. At the end of the passage, I stumbled into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a cracked lantern swinging from the ceiling. Dust floated in the light, motes drifting like tiny spirits. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a small desk against the wall. Papers were scattered across it, logs, letters, and journals, each yellowed with age. The handwriting was spidery, uneven, frantic. One journal caught my attention. The cover read simply, "The Keeper's Notes." My fingers trembled as I opened it, the pages brittle under my touch. The entries detailed the lighthouse's history, the keepers who had vanished, and the strange fog that clung like a living thing. "The lighthouse waits," one entry began. "It feeds on curiosity and fear. The fog is not natural. It is patient. Those who see too much, who linger too long, they are taken, absorbed into its memory." A chill ran down my spine. I realized that this wasn't just a building, it was a vessel, a prison, a sentient entity that existed between reality and something older, something beyond comprehension. Each keeper had left a warning, each visitor had vanished, and yet I had come too far to stop now. As I read further, a sudden sound made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the far corner of the room. My lantern's light flickered, revealing a shadow standing still, tall, hunched slightly, watching. My pulse raced. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice barely audible over the rain and wind. No response. The shadow remained, unmoving. I took a cautious step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The figure seemed to grow taller, stretching toward the ceiling. A low, guttural whisper echoed, not through my ears, but directly in my mind, "Do you understand yet? The lighthouse remembers, and the fog records everything." The air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me. Shapes swirled in the corners of my vision, figures that moved only when I blinked, disappearing when I looked directly at them. Panic surged, but I forced myself to breathe, to focus. The journal trembled in my hands. I turned a page and froze. A map had been drawn, showing hidden chambers, passages, and a spiral stairway descending below the lighthouse, into darkness deeper than the fog outside. A note scrawled in haste, "Below is the heart. Below is what the fog protects. Only the curious will reach it. Only the patient will see the keeper's secret." I knew instinctively that this was the path forward. My pulse hammered, fear mingling with determination. I placed the journal on the desk, taking the flickering lantern with me, and moved toward the stairway hidden behind a false panel. The descent was slow and treacherous. Water seeped through the stone walls, dripping rhythmically onto the floor. The fog followed, curling through the stairwell, brushing my skin, whispering incoherently. My shadow stretched along the walls, distorted and elongated, merging occasionally with shapes in the mist. Finally, I reached the bottom. The chamber below was enormous, circular, lit by an unnatural glow emanating from a pool of mist that hovered above the floor. Symbols etched into the walls pulsed faintly, glowing with a soft, eerie light. In the center stood a figure, a keeper, perhaps, or something older, watching me silently. The figure's face was obscured, but the presence was undeniable. I felt a weight pressing on my chest, a mix of dread and awe. The fog swirled around the figure, forming shapes that whispered, laughed, and wept all at once that I stepped closer. "Who? What are you?" I asked, voice trembling. The figure extended a hand toward me. I felt the fog wrap around my fingers, cold and soft, tugging me toward the center of the chamber. Whispers flooded my mind. The lighthouse chooses, the fog records, the keeper waits. Memories I didn't recognize flashed in my mind, faces of past visitors, past keepers, moments of terror and curiosity, all stored, all preserved by the lighthouse. I realized then that the entity was not malicious in the human sense. It was a recorder, a preserver, feeding on attention, observation, and fear. Those who lingered became part of it, living on in its memory. That I stumbled backward, trying to escape, but the fog tightened, guiding me gently yet insistently toward the figure. The whispers became a chorus. Do you accept the knowledge? Do you accept the memory? Or do you turn away? My mind raced. Escape seemed impossible, yet surrendering meant becoming part of the lighthouse's eternal memory, trapped in the fog for who knew how long. I took a deep breath, heart pounding. That I made a choice. That I stepped forward, hand reaching toward the keeper. The fog embraced me, cold and soft, and the whispers became clearer, forming words I could understand. You are patient. You are curious. Now you remember. The chamber shifted, the mist swirling faster, symbols on the walls glowing brighter. I felt knowledge flood my mind, the history of the lighthouse, the keepers, the fog, the endless cycle of observation and preservation. I became part of its memory, yet I remained aware enough to tell the story, aware enough to survive. When the fog finally receded, I found myself at the base of the lighthouse again. The storm had calmed, the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, and the sea was quiet. The journal lay at my feet, open to the last page. I read, "Those who seek shall remember. Those who remember shall tell the tale. Beware the fog, for it waits for the next curious soul." I looked back at the lighthouse. Shadows still clung to its walls, moving in the corners of vision, flickering like memories. I knew the keeper was still there, still waiting, still recording. And I would carry the memory forward. The journal slipped from my trembling hands, its pages fluttering shut as if it, too, wished to keep its secrets hidden. I staggered backward, the keeper's whisper still thrumming in my skull like a second heartbeat. You remember now. But memory is a curse as much as it is a gift. The air around me had grown heavier, thicker, as though every breath was drawn not from air but from the fog itself. My lungs ached with each inhale, my body screaming for escape. The lighthouse had shown me its truth, and now it was watching, waiting to see whether I would become another shadow within its endless memory. That I turned toward the spiral stairway that led upward. The stone steps were slick beneath my boots, water dripping steadily from above. The lantern shook in my grasp, its flame guttering with each draft of cold air. Shadows raced along the curved walls, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always moving just beyond sight. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of warning. At the top, I pushed against the wooden door. It resisted at first, swollen with dampness and age, then burst open with a groan, spilling me back into the keeper's quarters. The room was different now. Where once there had been scattered papers and a broken desk, now there were rows of mirrors, cracked, warped, and fogged with condensation. That and why reflections stared back at me from a dozen angles. Some smiled when I didn't. Some blinked slower than my own eyes. One, at the far end, tilted its head, studying me like prey. Panic surged. I dropped the lantern, the glass shattering, flame extinguishing in a hiss. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the faint silver glow of moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. My reflections lingered even without light, pale figures in glass, shifting when I turned away. That I bolted for the door. The hallway beyond stretched unnaturally long, each step pulling me deeper rather than closer to the exit. The walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, breathing in rhythm with my racing heart. The whispers returned, overlapping, endless. Stay, remember, you cannot leave. My hands brushed the cold stone as I ran, fingertips leaving trails of moisture on the slick surface. The air smelled of salt and rust, heavy with the weight of centuries. Finally, the corridor ended, opening onto the lighthouse's main stairwell, spiraling upward toward the beacon. That I hesitated. Escape meant the storm outside, the black sea, the consuming fog. But staying meant surrendering to the keeper's memory forever. My choice had already been made the moment I stepped inside. That I began to climb. The stairs seemed endless, coiling higher and higher, each creak of the wooden steps threatening collapse. Wind howled through shattered windows, flinging icy spray across my face. My legs burned with effort, but I pressed on, each step dragging me closer to freedom. Halfway up, I paused, chest heaving. Below me, shadows ascended the stairwell, dozens of them, moving without sound, without haste, yet gaining ground. Their forms shifted with each glance, sometimes human, sometimes twisted, elongated, impossible. That I forced myself upward, ignoring the ache in my muscles. The final landing loomed above, the door to the lantern room swaying on rusted hinges. I pushed through, stumbling into the highest chamber of the lighthouse. The beacon was shattered, its great glass lens fractured, shards littering the floor. Rain poured through holes in the roof, hissing as it struck the remnants of the lamp. The fog pressed against the windows, alive, eager, coiling like smoke waiting to be inhaled. And there, through the broken glass, I saw it. My boat. A speck against the black sea, tethered still to the rocks below. My only escape that I turned toward the stairs, but the shadows had arrived. They filled the room silently, dozens of them, their eyes pale and unblinking. Among them stood the keeper, its presence towering, inevitable. The whispers filled the chamber, deafening, drowning out the storm outside. You cannot leave, you are part of us now, I clenched my fists. No. I will not stay. The fog surged inward, smashing glass, rattling the walls. My body moved before thought, I climbed onto the railing, balanced for a heartbeat above the abyss, and leapt. The fall tore the breath from my lungs. Wind whipped against my face, rain stung like knives, and the roar of the ocean swallowed all sound. For a moment, I felt weightless, suspended between the lighthouse above and the black sea below, then the water struck cold. Crushing. Endless. The sea dragged me under, spinning me through darkness, filling my mouth and lungs with salt. I fought upward, arms burning, kicking desperately until my head broke the surface. The fog was everywhere, shapes moved within it, hands brushing my shoulders, voices murmuring my name. My boat drifted only feet away, rocking gently, impossibly close yet maddeningly distant. I forced my body forward, every stroke a battle against exhaustion. When I reached the boat, my fingers clawed at the slick wood, dragging myself aboard with the last strength I possessed. I collapsed onto the planks, coughing seawater, chest heaving, vision blurring. The fog clung to the boat, curling over the edges like curious fingers. But the lighthouse receded, its towering shadow swallowed by the storm. The keeper's whispers faded, leaving only the sound of rain and waves. That I lay there, shivering, drenched, staring at the dark sky above. Had I escaped? Or had the lighthouse merely let me go, another story to tell, another memory to carry into the world? The fog lingered, watching, waiting, and deep inside, I knew, the lighthouse was not finished with me. Not yet.